The ice is melting. Across the vast frozen wastes of North America and Europe, glaciers that have dominated the landscape for 100,000 years are finally retreating. The year is 12,900 years before our time, and Earth is experiencing the most dramatic warming period in human history. Rivers burst free from their icy prisons, carving new channels through landscapes that have known only frozen silence. Green shoots push through soil that hasn't seen sunlight for millennia. In what will one day become Britain, woolly rhinoceros graze in meadows where mile-thick ice once pressed down upon the earth. Vast herds of mammoth thunder across the steppes of Siberia, their migrations following the retreating edge of winter itself. The world is awakening from its longest sleep, and everywhere life is seizing this moment of liberation. Our ancestors stand at the threshold of a new age. These early humans, scattered in small bands across the warming continents, have survived the ultimate test. They have endured the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets stretched from the Arctic to the edges of modern-day New York and London. They have hunted mammoth in howling blizzards, sheltered in caves through winters that lasted 9 months, and passed down the crucial knowledge of fire and tool-making through generations who knew nothing but cold. Now, for the first time in their collective memory, the future looks bright. The warming trend has been steady for several thousand years. Each generation lives in a world slightly more hospitable than their parents knew. Forest edges creep northward, season by season. New hunting grounds open as the ice retreats. Rivers run clear and full, teeming with fish. The descendants of Ice Age survivors are becoming the inheritors of a warming Earth. In the Levant, some of these humans are beginning to experiment with something revolutionary. Instead of following herds across endless migrations, they are staying in one place, tending wild grasses that seem particularly promising. They are taking the first tentative steps toward agriculture, toward permanent settlements, toward civilization itself. The warming world offers them this luxury of stability, this possibility of thinking beyond mere survival. Across the Atlantic, in what will become North America, the Great Laurentide ice sheet continues its inexorable retreat. Meltwater lakes the size of small seas form at its edges, held back by walls of ice and debris. The geography of the continent is being rewritten daily as water finds new paths to the ocean. Species that have been locked in southern refugia for tens of thousands of years begin their long journey north, reclaiming territories their ancestors once knew. The Bering Land Bridge still connects Asia and America, but it grows narrower each year as rising seas nibble at its edges. Across this diminishing bridge, both animals and humans continue their ancient migrations, unaware that they are among the last to make this journey on dry land. In a few more centuries, this pathway will vanish beneath the waves, dividing the world's populations in ways that will shape human history for millennia to come. In the warming forests of Europe, our ancestors are developing new technologies suited to their changing world. The heavy, crude tools of the Ice Age are giving way to more sophisticated implements. Bone needles allow for finer clothing. Improved hunting weapons bring down the swift animals of the forest more efficiently than the massive spears designed for mammoth. Art flourishes in these communities, with cave paintings reaching new heights of sophistication, as if the warming world has freed not just their bodies, but their imaginations. The rhythm of life is changing. Where once survival meant following the herds through endless seasonal migrations, communities are beginning to establish semi-permanent camps. They return to the same favorable locations year after year, gradually improving their shelters, developing storage techniques for surplus food, and creating the social structures that will eventually become villages, towns, and cities. Yet for all this progress, for all this hope, these warming millennia carry within them the seeds of catastrophe. Deep in the heart of North America, a massive glacial lake holds more fresh water than all of today's Great Lakes combined. Lake Agassiz, as modern scientists would name it, is a temporary feature of the deglaciation process, but its existence will soon trigger one of the most dramatic climate reversals in Earth's history. The ice dam that holds back this enormous body of water is weakening. Cracks spread through the frozen barrier like a slow-motion earthquake. The warming that has brought such hope to human communities around the world is undermining the very foundations of the landscape itself. Forces beyond human comprehension are building toward a moment that will change everything. Nobody could have predicted what was coming. The warming had been so steady, so consistent, that it seemed like the new natural order. Hunters tracked their prey through expanding forests. Gatherers collected nuts and berries in groves that grew thicker each year. Children played in meadows that their grandparents had never imagined could exist. The Ice Age seemed like a nightmare finally ending, giving way to a gentler world where human ingenuity could flourish. But the Earth had one more terrible lesson to teach. In the space of a few decades, everything would change. The steady warming would not just stop, it would reverse catastrophically. Temperatures would plummet faster than they had risen. Ice would return with a vengeance that made the previous glaciation seem merciful by comparison. And humanity, just beginning to dream of permanence and prosperity, would find itself fighting for survival once again in a world gone mad with cold. The stage was set for the Younger Dryas, the most recent and perhaps most dramatic climate catastrophe in human history. In just a few years, the warming world would become a frozen nightmare that would last for more than 1,000 years, testing human endurance, adaptability, and will to survive in ways that still echo in our genetic memory today. The winter of 12,900 years ago began like any other. Across the warming lands of the Northern Hemisphere, human communities prepared for what they expected would be another mild, cold season in their gradually improving world. Hunters checked their stores of dried meat and gathered furs. Families reinforced their shelters with the confidence born of countless generations who had survived far worse conditions. The Ice Age was ending after all. Each winter was supposed to be a little less harsh than the last. But this winter was different. As the first snows fell across Europe, something felt wrong. The cold came earlier than expected, settling over the landscape with an intensity that seemed to mock the gentle warming of recent millennia. In the forests where oak and birch had begun to flourish, leaves turned brown and fell in autumn's earliest breath. The herds of deer and elk that had grown numerous during the warming period began their migration south earlier than anyone could remember. In the camps scattered across what would one day be called Germany and France, elders who had lived through 70 winters noticed the difference immediately. The cold had a quality they recognized from the stories of their grandparents, tales of the deep freeze that had gripped the world before the warming began. But surely those times were past. The ice had been retreating for thousands of years. This was just an unusually harsh season, nothing more. They were wrong. As weeks passed and the cold deepened instead of moderating, it became clear that something fundamental had changed. Rivers that had run freely for generations began to freeze solid. Game animals that had adapted to the warming climate started dying in unprecedented numbers. The very air seemed to carry a different quality of cold, a bone-deep chill that penetrated the heaviest furs in the warmest fires. In Greenland, where the evidence of this catastrophe would be preserved in ice for scientists to discover tens of thousands of years later, temperatures plummeted by 10 degrees Celsius in the span of just a few decades. This might sound gradual in human terms, but in geological time, it represented a climate shift of almost incomprehensible speed. The warming that had taken thousands of years to accomplish was undone in the blink of an eye. The cooling began in the Arctic regions and spread outward like a contagion of cold. The great ice sheets that had been retreating for millennia suddenly stopped their withdrawal and began to advance once more. In northern Scotland, glaciers that had not existed for thousands of years began to form again in the highlands. The Baltic Sea, which had been ice-free during summers for generations, became a frozen wasteland that would remain solid for months at a time. But the most dramatic changes occurred in North America, where the great Laurentide ice sheet reasserted its dominance over the landscape. The massive wall of ice that had retreated hundreds of miles suddenly began advancing again, grinding forward at a pace that was imperceptible day by day, but devastating season by season. Forests that had grown in the warming period were crushed beneath the advancing ice. Lakes that had hosted thriving ecosystems became frozen wastelands. The humans living in these regions faced a crisis unlike anything their ancestors had ever experienced. The gradual warming had allowed them to spread into territories that had been uninhabitable during the height of the Ice Age. Now those same territories became death traps as the cold returned with unprecedented fury. Communities that had established semi-permanent settlements were forced to abandon everything and flee southward, carrying only what they could manage in their desperate retreat. The psychological impact of this reversal cannot be overstated. For dozens of generations, The warming had been the one constant in human experience. Parents told their children that the world was getting better, that each year brought new possibilities, that the terrible cold of the ancient stories was fading into memory. The Younger Dryas shattered this fundamental assumption about the nature of reality itself. In what would become modern-day Britain, the Thames River froze completely solid for the first time in thousands of years. Woolly mammoths, which had been gradually disappearing from the landscape as forests replaced the tundra they preferred, suddenly found themselves in an environment that favored their survival once again. But even these ice-adapted giants struggled with the speed and severity of the climate change. Many populations that had survived the original ice age would not survive its sudden return. The cooling was not uniform across the globe. While the northern hemisphere experienced catastrophic temperature drops, some regions in the south actually became warmer. This created a complex pattern of climate change that disrupted weather systems on a planetary scale. The jet stream, that river of air that guides weather patterns across continents, became wildly unstable. Storms of unprecedented intensity battered regions that had known mild weather. Droughts struck areas that had enjoyed reliable rainfall for millennia. In Central Europe, the forests that had been expanding steadily for thousands of years began to die back with shocking rapidity. Oak trees that had grown for centuries succumbed to the sudden cold. The complex ecosystems that had developed during the warming period collapsed as species after species failed to adapt to the new conditions. Pollen records preserved in lake sediments tell the story of this ecological catastrophe in microscopic detail. The diversity of plant life that had flourished in the warming world was replaced by the stark monotony of cold-adapted species. The human communities scattered across this changing landscape faced challenges that tested every aspect of their survival skills. The hunting techniques that had worked during the warming period suddenly became obsolete as game animals either died or migrated to distant regions. The plant foods that had supplemented their diets disappeared as forests gave way to tundra. Even the materials they used for tools and shelter became scarce as the species they depended on vanished from their territories. Archaeological evidence from sites across Europe tells the story of human adaptation to these impossible conditions. Toolkits change rapidly as communities develop new technologies for survival in the suddenly hostile environment. The delicate bone needles and sophisticated artwork of the warming period gave way to cruder but more practical implements designed for basic survival. Storage techniques became more important as communities learned to hoard every scrap of food against the longer, harsher winters. The social structures of human communities also underwent dramatic changes. The relatively egalitarian societies that had developed during the warming period, when resources were becoming more abundant, were replaced by more hierarchical organizations focused on survival. Leaders emerged who could organize the complex logistics of migration and resource management. Shamans and storytellers gained new importance as communities struggled to make sense of their transformed world. In the archaeological record of this period, we see evidence of increased conflict between human groups. As resources became scarce and territories shifted, communities were forced to compete for the remaining habitable areas. Weapons designed for warfare rather than hunting appear more frequently in archaeological sites. Defensive settlements replaced the open camps of the warming period. The cooperative spirit that had characterized human expansion during the good times gave way to the desperate competition of crisis. The speed of the climate change meant that traditional knowledge systems, passed down through generations, suddenly became inadequate or even dangerous. Elders who had learned the patterns of weather and wildlife during the warming period found their expertise useless in the new world. Young people who had never experienced true cold were forced to relearn survival techniques that their great-grandparents had known but had not needed to pass on. In Eastern Europe and Western Asia, nomadic communities that had followed the herds across vast territories found their traditional migration routes blocked by ice or transformed by the changing climate. The reindeer and other Arctic species that had been retreating northward suddenly became the dominant fauna across much larger territories. Human groups that had specialized in hunting temperate forest animals were forced to develop entirely new skill sets or face starvation. The Younger Dryas cold period was not just a return to Ice Age conditions. In many ways, it was worse than the original glaciation. The sudden nature of the change meant that neither human communities nor wildlife populations had time to adapt gradually. Species that had survived the long, slow cooling of the previous ice age were wiped out by the rapid temperature drop. Entire ecosystems collapsed in the span of decades rather than millennia. In North America, the situation was particularly dire. The great ice sheets advanced so rapidly that human communities were forced to abandon vast territories almost overnight in geological terms. The rich hunting grounds of the Great Lakes region, which had supported thriving populations during the warming period, became uninhabitable glacial wasteland. Communities were compressed into smaller and smaller areas of habitable land, intensifying competition for resources. The mammalian megafauna that had characterized the end of the Ice Age began to disappear at an accelerated rate. Woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, cave bears, and dozens of other species that had survived the original glaciation succumbed to the rapid environmental changes of the Younger Dryas. Whether their extinction was due to climate change, human hunting pressure, or a combination of both remains a subject of scientific debate, but the timing suggests that the sudden return to Ice Age conditions played a major role. The plant communities across the affected regions underwent equally dramatic transformations. Forests that had taken thousands of years to establish were replaced by tundra vegetation in just a few decades. The complex web of relationships between plants, animals, and human communities that had developed during the warming period was shattered. Seeds that had been carefully saved for planting sprouted into plants that could not survive the new conditions. Traditional food sources disappeared, forcing communities to rediscover survival techniques their ancestors had used during the darkest days of the Ice Age. Water sources, which had been reliable during the warming period, became unpredictable or disappeared entirely. Rivers that had run freely for millennia froze solid. Springs that had never failed went dry as the water table shifted in response to the changing climate. Communities were forced to travel longer distances for water, exposing themselves to greater dangers and expending precious energy that was desperately needed for basic survival. The clothing and shelter technologies that had evolved during the warming period proved inadequate for the new conditions. Lighter garments suitable for milder winters provided insufficient protection against the returning cold. Shelter designs that had worked when winters were shorter and less severe became death traps in the extended freeze of the Younger Dryas. Communities were forced to develop new techniques for insulation and heating, often rediscovering methods their ancestors had used but which had been abandoned during the warming period. Fire, always crucial to human survival, became even more critical during the Younger Dryas. The wood that had been abundant during the warming period became scarce as forests died back. Communities were forced to travel longer distances to gather fuel and to develop more efficient burning techniques to make their precious stores of wood last through the extended winters. The knowledge of how to maintain fire through the worst conditions became literally a matter of life and death. The psychological toll of the Younger Dryas on human communities is difficult to imagine. The generations that experienced the onset of the cooling had been raised with the expectation that their world was steadily improving. Parents had told their children stories of the harsh conditions their ancestors had endured, but these had seemed like ancient history, cautionary tales from a darker time that was safely in the past. The return of Ice Age conditions shattered this worldview completely. Religious and spiritual systems underwent profound changes as communities struggled to explain what had happened to their world. The warming period had been associated with benevolent spirits and favorable omens. The sudden return of the cold was interpreted as evidence of divine displeasure or cosmic upheaval. Shamans and spiritual leaders were called upon to explain the inexplicable and to intercede with whatever forces had brought this catastrophe upon their people. The oral traditions that developed during this period would echo through human culture for millennia. Stories of a world before the cold, when conditions were better and life was easier, became central to the mythologies of countless cultures. The memory of the Younger Dryas would be preserved in flood myths, tales of world-ending catastrophes, and stories of golden ages lost to cosmic misfortune. As the years passed and it became clear that the cold was not temporary, human communities were forced to make fundamental adaptations to their new reality. The semi-nomadic lifestyle that had been giving way to more settled existence during the warming period was abandoned in favor of highly mobile survival strategies. Communities developed the ability to move quickly across vast distances in search of resources, abandoning the heavy material culture that had begun to develop during more stable times. The Younger Dryas lasted not for a single harsh winter or even a few difficult years, but for more than a millennium. Entire human lifetimes passed without any memory of the warmer conditions that had preceded the catastrophe. Children were born, grew to adulthood, and died of old age, knowing only the world of endless winter. The warming period became legend, then myth, then almost forgotten altogether. The children born into the frozen world of the Younger Dryas knew nothing of the warmth their grandparents remembered. For them, the endless winter was not a catastrophe, but simply the way the world had always been. They grew up in a landscape where survival required skills that had been forgotten during the warming millennia, where every day brought new challenges that tested the limits of human endurance and ingenuity. In the camps scattered across the ice-locked territories of Europe and North America, these young people learned to read the subtle signs that meant the difference between life and death. They could tell from the color of smoke whether a fire would burn cleanly or produce the deadly fumes that could suffocate a family in their sleep. They knew which plants, buried beneath the snow, could provide enough nutrition to keep them alive for another day, and which would bring only sickness and death. The education of a Younger Dryas child began before they could walk. Mothers carried their infants in specially designed wrappings that provided maximum warmth while allowing for quick movement when danger threatened. From the earliest age, children learned to be silent when silence was needed, to move quickly when speed was essential, and to endure discomfort without complaint when survival depended on the group's ability to function as a unit. By the age of 5, children were expected to contribute to the group's survival. They gathered dried grasses for kindling, sorted stones for tool-making, and helped prepare the animal hides that provided protection against the cold. Their small fingers were particularly valuable for detailed work, like removing insects from stored food or threading sinew through tiny holes in clothing. Every member of the community, regardless of age, had essential roles to play in the complex choreography of survival. The games children played during this period were not simply entertainment, but training for the realities they would face as adults. They practiced building emergency shelters from whatever materials were available, competed to see who could start a fire fastest in windy conditions, and learned to track animals across snow and ice. These activities developed the reflexes and instincts that would later keep them alive in situations where hesitation meant death. Language itself evolved to meet the demands of the New World. Younger Dryas communities developed vocabularies with dozens of words for different types of snow and ice, each describing conditions that could affect travel, hunting, or shelter construction. They had specific terms for the subtle variations in animal behavior that indicated changing weather, the different qualities of wood that affected how long it would burn, and the stages of hypothermia that helped them recognize when a community member was in danger. The oral traditions that developed during this period served multiple functions beyond simple entertainment. Stories became vehicles for preserving crucial survival information, with seemingly fantastical tales encoding practical knowledge about everything from predicting weather patterns to identifying edible plants. The epics that elders recited around fires during the long winter nights were actually sophisticated information storage systems, ensuring that vital knowledge would be passed down accurately through generations. Memory techniques reached extraordinary levels of sophistication during the Younger Dryas. In communities where writing did not exist and where the loss of crucial information could mean death for the entire group, individuals developed the ability to memorize vast amounts of practical knowledge with perfect accuracy. Shamans and knowledge keepers could recite detailed instructions for complex survival procedures, complete genealogies going back dozens of generations, and precise descriptions of distant territories that might provide refuge during times of crisis. The social structures that emerged during this period were unlike anything that had existed during the warming phase of human development. Leadership was based not on wealth or inherited status, but on proven competence in the skills essential for group survival. The best hunters, the most skilled toolmakers, the most reliable weather readers, and the most effective organizers of group movements rose to positions of authority based entirely on their demonstrated abilities. Women played crucial roles in these survival communities, often specializing in knowledge areas that were just as vital as hunting and warfare. Female specialists became experts in plant identification, food preservation, clothing construction, and medical treatment. They developed sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and physiology, creating treatments for everything from frostbite to broken bones, using only the materials available in their harsh environment. The psychological challenges faced by Younger Dryas communities were as severe as the physical hardships. The constant stress of survival in hostile conditions, combined with the knowledge that their ancestors had lived in better times, created mental health challenges that required sophisticated social responses. Communities developed elaborate rituals and ceremonies designed to maintain group morale and individual psychological resilience. Storytelling traditions during this period often focused on themes of endurance, adaptation, and hope for eventual improvement. Epic narratives celebrated heroes who had overcome impossible odds, survived catastrophic events, and led their people to safety through wisdom and courage. These stories served as both entertainment and psychological therapy, reminding listeners that survival was possible even in the most desperate circumstances. The art that developed during the Younger Dryas reflected both the harsh realities of daily life and the human need for beauty and meaning even in the most difficult times. Cave paintings from this period show detailed depictions of hunting scenes, survival techniques, and spiritual beliefs. The artists who created these works often did so in caves that provided temporary shelter during migrations, leaving behind records of their experiences for future generations to discover. Musical traditions also evolved to meet the needs of communities living under extreme stress. Songs served as memory aids for important information, coordination tools for group activities, and emotional outlets for dealing with the psychological pressures of constant survival challenges. Instruments made from bone, wood, and animal hide provided accompaniment for ceremonies that helped maintain social cohesion during the darkest times. The clothing technologies that developed during the Younger Dryas represent some of the most sophisticated cold weather gear ever created. Using only materials available from hunting and gathering, communities learned to create layered clothing systems that provided extraordinary protection against extreme cold. These garments were not simply functional, but often beautifully decorated, demonstrating that even in the most challenging circumstances, humans maintain their need for aesthetic expression. Footwear design reached particular heights of sophistication during this period. Younger Dryas communities created boots and shoes that could keep feet warm and dry in conditions that would defeat modern winter gear. These designs incorporated multiple layers of insulation, waterproof outer shells made from specially prepared animal hides, and traction systems that allowed safe movement across ice and snow. The shelters constructed during the Younger Dryas were marvels of engineering that maximized warmth while minimizing the materials and energy required for construction. These structures used principles of insulation, air circulation, and heat retention that would not be formally understood by science for thousands of years. The builders learned to create spaces that could maintain livable temperatures even when outside conditions would kill an unprotected human in minutes. Food preservation and storage became arts of extraordinary sophistication during this period. Communities developed techniques for smoking, drying, fermenting, and freezing foods that could keep them edible for months or even years. These methods required precise understanding of timing, temperature, and chemical processes, all achieved through careful observation and experimentation over generations. The hunting strategies that evolved during the Younger Dryas required unprecedented levels of cooperation and planning. Large game animals that had been abundant during the warming period were now scarce and widely scattered. Successful hunts required the coordination of dozens of individuals over vast territories, with precise timing and flawless execution. The failure of a single hunt could mean starvation for an entire community. Tracking skills reached levels that seem almost supernatural to modern observers. Younger Dryas hunters could follow animal trails across snow and ice for days, reading subtle signs that revealed not just the passage of their prey, but its health, behavior, and likely destinations. They understood animal psychology so completely that they could predict where herds would move in response to changing weather conditions, allowing them to position themselves for successful hunts. The weapons developed during this period represented significant advances over earlier hunting technologies. Spear throwers increased the range and accuracy of projectile weapons, while improved spear points provided better penetration and more reliable kills. Bow and arrow technology, which may have been invented during the Younger Dryas, revolutionized hunting by allowing hunters to kill animals from safe distances. Trap construction became incredibly sophisticated as communities learned to capture animals without the energy expenditure required for active hunting. These devices use principles of engineering and animal behavior that demonstrate remarkable understanding of both physics and psychology. The most elaborate traps could capture large animals without human presence, allowing hunters to cover much larger territories than would be possible with traditional hunting methods. The fishing techniques developed during the Younger Dryas were particularly important in regions where terrestrial game was scarce. Communities learned to exploit fish populations through methods that included sophisticated nets, underwater traps, and seasonal fishing strategies that maximized yields during brief periods when fish were concentrated in accessible locations. Ice fishing became an essential skill in regions where surface waters were frozen for most of the year. Plant gathering during the Younger Dryas required encyclopedic knowledge of botanical resources that could provide nutrition even in the harshest conditions. Gatherers learned to identify hundreds of species of plants, knowing which parts were edible, when they should be harvested, and how they should be prepared to maximize their nutritional value. This knowledge included understanding of plant chemistry that allowed them to neutralize toxins and concentrate nutrients. The seasonal cycles that governed Younger Dryas life were far more extreme than anything experienced during the warming period. Communities had to plan activities around winters that could last 8 or 9 months, with only brief summers that provided opportunities for travel, major hunts, and gathering activities. The timing of these activities was crucial, as miscalculation could leave a community without adequate resources for the long winter ahead. Migration patterns during this period were incredibly complex, involving the movement of entire communities across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. These journeys required precise knowledge of routes, weather patterns, and resource availability along the way. The logistics of moving groups that included elderly individuals, pregnant women, and small children across frozen landscapes represent organizational achievements of remarkable sophistication. Communication between distant communities became essential for survival during the Younger Dryas. Groups developed methods for leaving messages for other travelers, creating networks of information exchange that allowed communities to learn about conditions in distant territories, the movements of game animals, and the availability of resources. These communication systems required standardized symbols and protocols that could be understood by people from different cultural backgrounds. The leadership structures that emerged during this period had to balance the need for quick decision-making in crisis situations with the importance of maintaining group cohesion and morale. Leaders were expected to demonstrate not only practical competence, but also the psychological strength needed to maintain hope and determination during the darkest times. The most successful leaders were those who could inspire their followers to continue struggling, even when survival seemed impossible. Trade relationships between communities took on new importance during the Younger Dryas, as groups specialized in different survival strategies and technologies. Some communities became experts in particular types of tool-making, while others developed specialized knowledge of specific hunting techniques or resource exploitation methods. The exchange of goods and knowledge between these groups was essential for maintaining the diversity of skills needed for long-term survival. The spiritual and religious systems that developed during this period reflected both the harsh realities of daily life and the human need for meaning in the face of seemingly endless suffering. Younger Dryas spirituality often focused on themes of endurance, sacrifice, and the hope for eventual redemption. Rituals and ceremonies provided frameworks for dealing with death, loss, and the psychological challenges of survival in hostile conditions. Burial practices during the Younger Dryas reveal sophisticated understanding of both practical and spiritual concerns. Bodies were often interred with tools, clothing, and food that would be needed in the afterlife. But the burial sites were also chosen and constructed to prevent scavenging by animals and to mark territories for future reference. These practices demonstrate the continued importance of maintaining cultural traditions even under the most difficult circumstances. The astronomical knowledge that developed during this period was largely practical in nature, focused on navigation and seasonal prediction rather than abstract understanding. Younger Dryas communities learned to use the positions of stars and planets to navigate across featureless landscapes and to predict seasonal changes with the precision needed for survival planning. This knowledge was encoded in myths and stories that could be accurately transmitted across generations. The children who grew up during the later phases of the Younger Dryas would carry these survival skills and cultural adaptations with them when the warming finally returned. Their descendants would build the first permanent settlements, develop agriculture, and create the foundations of human civilization. But they would never forget the lessons learned during the 1,000 years of cold, and the echoes of Younger Dryas survival strategies would influence human culture long after the ice had melted and the world had become warm again. The Great Dying began slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Across the frozen landscapes of North America and Eurasia, the magnificent creatures that had dominated the world since the end of the last ice age started to disappear. Not in dramatic scenes of carnage, but quietly as populations dwindled and breeding grounds were abandoned. The megafauna that had survived hundreds of thousands of years of glacial cycles, that had endured the worst the Ice Age could offer, were being systematically erased from existence by the sudden return of conditions they had once called home. The woolly mammoth, that icon of Ice Age survival, found itself caught in an impossible situation. These giants had thrived during the original glaciation, their massive bodies perfectly adapted to life in the frozen tundra. But the Younger Dryas was different from the slow cooling that had preceded it. The rapid change left no time for the gradual adaptations that had allowed their ancestors to survive previous climate shifts. Herds that had numbered in the thousands were reduced to scattered groups of desperate survivors, searching for the specific combination of vegetation and terrain they needed to survive. In the vast expanses of Siberia, mammoth families that had followed traditional migration routes for millennia found their ancient pathways blocked by ice that had formed with unprecedented speed. The timing of their movements, perfected over countless generations, no longer matched the rhythm of the changing seasons. Springs arrived weeks later than expected, if they came at all. Rivers that had provided reliable crossing points were either frozen solid or had changed course entirely as the landscape itself was reshaped by the advancing ice. The psychological impact on these intelligent creatures cannot be underestimated. Mammoths possess complex social structures and sophisticated communication systems. They grieved for their dead, cared for their young with remarkable dedication, and passed knowledge down through generations in ways that paralleled human cultural transmission. As their world collapsed around them, these ancient giants experienced something that can only be described as collective trauma. The youngest members of mammoth herds suffered the most. Calves born during the Younger Dryas faced challenges that no mammoth had encountered for tens of thousands of years. The vegetation their species depended on became increasingly scarce as grasslands gave way to barren tundra. Mothers struggled to produce enough milk to sustain their young in the face of their own malnutrition. The complex social bonds that held mammoth families together began to fracture under the stress of constant hunger and cold. Archaeological evidence from this period tells a story of desperate adaptation that ultimately failed. Mammoth bones found in Younger Dryas deposits show signs of malnutrition and disease that were rare during previous periods. The giants were eating increasingly marginal vegetation, stripping bark from trees and consuming plants that provided little nutritional value. Their tusks, which had grown to magnificent proportions during the warming period, became stunted and malformed as calcium and other essential nutrients became scarce. The last mammoth populations retreated to isolated refugia where conditions remained marginally suitable for their survival. Small islands of habitat scattered across the vastness of Siberia and Alaska became the final strongholds of creatures that had once roamed across continents. But these refugees were too small and too scattered to support viable breeding populations over the long term. Genetic diversity declined as small groups were forced to inbreed, weakening the species further just when strength was most needed. The giant ground sloths of North America faced similar challenges, but with even fewer options for adaptation. These massive creatures, some weighing as much as elephants, had specialized in exploiting specific plant communities that flourished during the warming period. Unlike mammoths, which were relatively mobile, ground sloths were adapted for life in more stable environments where they could rely on predictable food sources and established territories. When the Younger Dryas struck, the forests and woodlands that ground sloths depended on began dying back across vast areas. The trees and shrubs that provided their primary food sources either died outright from the sudden cold or became dormant for extended periods that exceeded the animals' ability to survive without food. The slow metabolism that had been an advantage during times of abundance became a liability when energy conservation meant the difference between life and death. The cave bears of Europe, massive predators that had dominated the continent's ecosystems for hundreds of thousands of years, discovered that their size and strength were no match for the changing climate. These bears had evolved to take advantage of specific seasonal patterns, timing their hibernation and breeding cycles to match the availability of food sources. The Younger Dryas disrupted these patterns so completely that the bears could no longer synchronize their life cycles with their environment. Hibernation became a death sentence for many cave bears during the Younger Dryas. The extended winters left insufficient time for bears to accumulate the fat reserves needed to survive months of dormancy. Bears that entered hibernation in poor condition simply never woke up. Those that survived the winter emerged to find that their traditional food sources had disappeared or migrated to territories beyond their reach. The saber-toothed cats that had been apex predators throughout the warming period found themselves in a world where their specialized hunting techniques no longer provided reliable success. These magnificent cats had evolved to take down the large herbivores that had thrived during the warming period. But as their prey species declined or changed their behavior patterns in response to the climate crisis, the saber-toothed found it increasingly difficult to secure the large kills they needed to survive. The social structures of saber-toothed cat populations began to break down as competition for scarce prey intensified. Cats that had previously maintained stable territories were forced to range over ever larger areas in search of food. This brought them into conflict with other predators and disrupted the breeding patterns that had maintained stable populations for thousands of years. The giant beavers of North America, creatures the size of black bears that had engineered entire landscapes during the warming period, faced the destruction of their aquatic habitats as rivers froze solid and wetland ecosystems collapsed. These animals had been among the most successful megafauna species, using their intelligence and engineering skills to create environments that supported not only their own populations, but entire communities of other species. The dams and waterways that giant beavers had constructed over thousands of years became death traps during the Younger Dryas. Rivers that had been carefully managed to provide optimal conditions for beaver colonies became frozen channels that could no longer support aquatic life. The elaborate lodge systems that had provided protection from predators and weather became ice-locked prisons that trapped families of beavers beneath the frozen surface. Birds of prey that had specialized in hunting the megafauna discovered that their prey base was collapsing beneath them. Giant condors and enormous eagles that had soared over herds of mammoth and ground sloth found themselves with increasingly little to scavenge. These birds, with their massive wingspans and energy requirements, needed large carcasses to survive. As the megafauna populations dwindled, the scavenger species that depended on them faced their own extinction crisis. The cascade effects of megafauna extinction rippled through entire ecosystems in ways that are still being discovered by modern scientists. The massive herbivores had been ecosystem engineers, their feeding, trampling, and waste production shaping the very landscapes they inhabited. Mammoth herds had maintained the grasslands of the mammoth steppe through their grazing patterns, preventing forests from taking over and maintaining the open landscapes that supported dozens of other species. When the great herbivores disappeared, the plant communities they had maintained began to change rapidly. Without constant grazing pressure, shrublands expanded into former grasslands, altering the fire patterns, soil chemistry, and hydrology of vast regions. These changes made the remaining habitat even less suitable for the surviving megafauna populations, accelerating their decline in a feedback loop that ultimately proved impossible to break. The smaller predators and scavengers that had depended on megafauna carcasses for food were forced to adapt or die. Wolf populations that had specialized in hunting mammoth calves and other young megafauna had to learn new hunting techniques or face starvation. Hyena species that had thrived on the abundant carrion provided by large herbivore die-offs found themselves competing for increasingly scarce resources. Even the human communities living through this period witnessed the end of the world they had known with a mixture of wonder and terror. Elders told stories of times when mammoth herds darkened the horizon, when the thunder of their movement could be felt through the ground for miles. Children growing up during the Younger Dryas heard these tales as myths from a lost golden age, finding it impossible to imagine landscapes populated by such creatures. For human hunters, the extinction of the megafauna represented both a practical crisis and a spiritual catastrophe. These animals had been more than just sources of food and materials. They had been central to the religious and cultural systems that gave meaning to human existence. The loss of species that had been hunted, revered, and feared for thousands of years left communities struggling to maintain their connections to the natural world. The practical implications were equally severe. A single mammoth could provide enough meat to feed a large community for weeks, along with hides for shelter, bones for tools, and ivory for trade goods. The disappearance of these massive resources forced human communities to develop entirely new subsistence strategies based on smaller, more dispersed food sources that required different hunting techniques and social organizations. Some human communities may have played a role in accelerating the extinction process, but the primary driver was clearly the rapid climate change of the Younger Dryas. Archaeological evidence suggests that human hunting pressure increased during this period as communities became more desperate for resources, but the timing and pattern of extinctions closely matches the climate changes rather than human population growth or technological advances. The end of the megafauna era marked more than just the loss of individual species. It represented the closure of an entire chapter in Earth's biological history. The Younger Dryas extinctions eliminated the last remnants of the great Pleistocene fauna that had dominated the planet for millions of years. When the climate finally stabilized and warming returned, the world that emerged would be biologically impoverished compared to the richness that had existed before. The genetic legacy of the extinct megafauna was lost forever, taking with it millions of years of evolutionary adaptation and biological innovation. Modern attempts to de-extinct species like the woolly mammoth represent efforts to recover just a tiny fraction of the biological diversity that was erased during this relatively brief period of climate catastrophe. The landscapes that emerged from the Younger Dryas were fundamentally different from those that had existed before. Without the great herbivores to maintain them, grasslands gave way to forests and shrublands. River systems, no longer shaped by the activities of giant beavers, developed new patterns of flow and flooding. The very structure of ecosystems was simplified as the complex relationships that had existed between megafauna and their environments were severed. The human survivors of the Younger Dryas carried with them memories and cultural traditions that preserved echoes of the lost megafauna. Cave paintings, oral traditions, and religious beliefs maintained connections to animals that no longer existed in the physical world. These cultural memories would persist for thousands of years, influencing human art, mythology, and spiritual practices long after the last mammoth had died and the great cats had vanished into extinction. The lesson of the Younger Dryas extinctions was harsh but clear. Even the most successful and well-adapted species could be eliminated by sufficiently rapid environmental change. The creatures that had survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and asteroid impacts were helpless against the speed of climate transformation that characterized this period. Their extinction served as a warning about the fragility of even the most robust ecosystems in the face of sudden change. Yet somehow, against all odds, humanity survived. The same adaptability and resilience that had carried our species through the original ice age served them once again during this unexpected return to glacial conditions. Communities developed new technologies, new social structures, and new survival strategies. They learned to thrive in conditions that would have been considered impossible during the warming period. The end of the Younger Dryas, when it finally came, would be as sudden and dramatic as its beginning, but that was still 1,000 years in the future. For now, the world had become a place of ice and hardship once again, and the humans who inhabit it were beginning the long process of adapting to their transformed reality. In the heart of what would one day become Canada, a body of water larger than all of today's Great Lakes combined stretched across the landscape like an inland sea. Lake Agassiz, named by future scientists after the geologist who would first recognize its significance, contained more fresh water than any lake that had ever existed on Earth. Its shores extended from the edge of the retreating Laurentide ice sheet in the north to the headwaters of the Mississippi River system in the south, covering an area that would encompass much of modern Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and the northern United States. This was no ordinary lake. It was a temporary feature of the deglaciation process, a massive repository of meltwater held back by walls of ice and glacial debris that formed natural dams of unprecedented scale. For thousands of years during the warming period that preceded the Younger Dryas, Lake Agassiz had grown steadily larger as the ice sheets retreated and more meltwater flowed into its basin. The lake served as a vast storage system for the water that was slowly being released from the melting continental glaciers, a geological safety valve that regulated the flow of fresh water into the world's oceans. The shores of Lake Agassiz were unlike anything that exists in the modern world. Along its northern edge, massive icebergs calved from the retreating glacier face, floating like mountains of ice across the dark waters. These bergs carried with them rocks and debris that had been scraped from the continental interior during the glacier's advance, creating a constantly changing landscape of ice sculptures that dwarfed anything found in today's Arctic waters. The southern shores of the lake were more stable, supporting diverse ecosystems that had developed during the thousands of years of the lake's existence. Vast wetlands extended for hundreds of miles, providing habitat for countless species of waterfowl, fish, and other aquatic life. These ecosystems had become some of the most productive on Earth, fed by the constant input of nutrients from glacial meltwater and supporting food webs of extraordinary complexity. Human communities had established themselves along the shores of Lake Agassiz, taking advantage of the abundant resources the Great Lake provided. These settlements were among the most sophisticated of their time, with semi-permanent structures, elaborate fishing technologies, and trade networks that extended across much of North America. The people who lived around Lake Agassiz had developed a culture uniquely adapted to life beside the Great Water, with canoe technologies, fishing techniques, and seasonal migration patterns that allowed them to exploit the lake's resources throughout the year. The ice dams that held back Lake Agassiz were marvels of natural engineering, but they were also fundamentally unstable structures. These barriers consisted of glacial ice mixed with enormous quantities of rock, soil, and organic debris that had been pushed together by the advancing ice sheets. The dams were constantly changing as the ice melted, refroze, and shifted under the enormous pressure of the water they contained. For thousands of years, these ice dams had held firm, releasing water slowly and steadily through controlled outlets that allowed the lake's level to remain relatively stable. Small breaches in the dams were quickly sealed by the ongoing glacial processes, while overflow channels carried excess water south through the Mississippi River system. This natural regulation had allowed ecosystems to develop around the lake and had prevented catastrophic flooding in the regions downstream. But as the warming period continued and the ice sheets retreated further, the stability of the dam system began to deteriorate. The ice that formed the core of the barriers was becoming thinner and more riddled with channels and weak points. The pressure from the enormous volume of water in Lake Agassiz was constant and unrelenting, probing every crack and flaw in the structures that contained it. The process that would ultimately lead to catastrophe began with small, seemingly insignificant changes in the dam structure. Warmer summers caused increased melting of the ice components, while autumn freezes created expansion and contraction cycles that weakened the overall integrity of the barriers. Underground channels began to form as water found its way through cracks in the ice and debris, gradually enlarging these pathways through erosion and thermal effects. The indigenous peoples living around Lake Agassiz may have noticed the subtle signs of what was coming. Traditional ecological knowledge, passed down through generations, would have included understanding of ice conditions, water levels, and seasonal patterns that modern observers might miss. Elders who had spent their entire lives beside the Great Lake might have recognized changes in the sounds the ice made, the patterns of meltwater flow, or the behavior of animals that indicated something fundamental was shifting. The final collapse, when it came, was catastrophic beyond imagination. The exact trigger may have been a particularly warm summer, an earthquake, or simply the accumulated stress of years of gradual weakening reaching a critical threshold. Whatever the immediate cause, the result was the sudden and complete failure of the ice dam system that had contained Lake Agassiz for millennia. The breach began as a trickle, then a stream, then a torrent that quickly carved through the weakened dam structure. Within hours, gaps that had started as narrow channels became massive canyons through which the entire volume of Lake Agassiz began to drain. The sound of the collapsing dam must have been audible for hundreds of miles, a roar of breaking ice and rushing water that announced the beginning of one of the most dramatic flood events in Earth's history. The volume of water released by the Agassiz Dam failure was almost incomprehensible. Modern estimates suggest that the lake contained more than 160,000 cubic kilometers of fresh water, enough to cover the entire United States to a depth of several feet. This enormous volume was released not gradually over centuries, but catastrophically over a period of months or possibly even weeks. The floodwaters carved new channels across the landscape as they sought the fastest route to the sea. Existing river valleys were scoured clean by torrents that dwarfed anything in the historical record. The flood carried with it countless thousands of tons of ice, rock, and debris, transforming the geography of an entire continent as it passed. Forests that had taken thousands of years to grow were stripped away in hours. Hills were carved into valleys, and valleys were filled with sediment to become new plains. The human communities around Lake Agassiz faced an apocalyptic scenario that must have seemed like the end of the world itself. Those who lived on the shores of the lake would have had little warning as the waters began to drain away with terrifying speed. Settlements that had existed for generations were abandoned in desperate flights to higher ground. The sophisticated cultures that had developed around the lake's resources were scattered to the winds, their knowledge and traditions disrupted by the need for immediate survival. But the local effects of the dam failure, devastating as they were, paled in comparison to what happened when the floodwaters reached the ocean. The fresh water from Lake Agassiz poured into the North Atlantic with a force and volume that had never been experienced in human history. This was not a gradual increase in freshwater input, but a massive pulse that fundamentally altered the chemistry and circulation patterns of the entire ocean basin. The North Atlantic Ocean operates as a crucial component of the global climate system through a process known as thermohaline circulation. This circulation pattern, driven by differences in temperature and salinity, carries warm surface water northward from the tropics and returns cold, dense water southward at depth. This circulation system, sometimes called the ocean's conveyor belt, is responsible for keeping Europe and eastern North America much warmer than their latitude would otherwise allow. The circulation depends critically on the formation of deep water in the North Atlantic, a process that occurs when surface water becomes dense enough to sink to the ocean floor. This density increase happens when warm tropical water reaches the Arctic regions and cools dramatically while also becoming saltier through evaporation and ice formation. The cold, salty water that results is heavy enough to sink to the ocean depths, driving the entire circulation system. The massive influx of fresh water from Lake Agassiz disrupted this delicate process completely. Fresh water is less dense than salt water, and the enormous volume released by the dam failure created a layer of relatively light water across much of the North Atlantic surface. This freshwater cap prevented the normal cooling and sinking of surface water, effectively shutting down the thermohaline circulation that had been carrying heat to the northern regions. The effect was like turning off a massive heating system that had been warming the entire North Atlantic region for thousands of years. Without the constant flow of warm water from the south, temperatures in Europe and eastern North America began to plummet almost immediately. The warming trend that had characterized the end of the Ice Age was not only halted, but dramatically reversed as the ocean current system that had made that warming possible was shut down. The shutdown of Atlantic circulation had effects that extended far beyond the immediate vicinity of the ocean. The atmospheric circulation patterns that depend on temperature differences between different regions were disrupted as the North Atlantic cooled rapidly. Weather systems that had been relatively stable for thousands of years became chaotic and unpredictable. Storm tracks shifted, precipitation patterns changed, and seasonal cycles were thrown into confusion. In Europe, the effects were felt within years of the dam failure. Temperatures that had been steadily warming for millennia began to drop precipitously. The growing seasons that had been lengthening year by year suddenly became shorter and more unpredictable. Crops that had been successfully cultivated in regions freed from glacial conditions during the warming period began to fail as frost returned to areas that hadn't experienced killing freezes for thousands of years. The psychological impact on human communities was devastating. Generations of steady improvement in living conditions had created expectations of continued progress toward a warmer, more hospitable world. The sudden reversal of this trend must have seemed like evidence of cosmic displeasure or supernatural intervention. The gradual optimism that had characterized human culture during the warming period was replaced by confusion, fear, and desperate attempts to understand what had gone wrong with the natural order. The freshwater pulse from Lake Agassiz was not the only factor contributing to the circulation shutdown, but it was almost certainly the trigger that initiated the catastrophic climate reversal. Other meltwater sources, including the Hudson Bay and Arctic drainage systems, were also contributing fresh water to the North Atlantic, but the Agassiz release provided the massive, sudden input that pushed the ocean system past its tipping point. Modern climate scientists studying the Younger Dryas have used computer models to simulate the effects of different freshwater inputs on Atlantic circulation. These models consistently show that an event of the magnitude of the Lake Agassiz dam failure would be more than sufficient to shut down thermohaline circulation for extended periods. The models also suggest that once such a shutdown occurs, it can become self-reinforcing, making it difficult for normal circulation to resume even after the initial freshwater input has been diluted. The geological evidence for the Lake Agassiz flood is written in the landscape of North America in features that can still be observed today. The channeled scablands of eastern Washington, carved by catastrophic floods during the Ice Age, provide a model for understanding the scale of erosion that such events can produce. Similar but less dramatic features across the Great Lakes region and the Canadian prairies mark the path of the Agassiz floodwaters. Sediment cores taken from the ocean floor provide additional evidence of the catastrophic drainage event. Layers of freshwater diatoms and other indicators of continental water sources appear suddenly in Atlantic sediments at precisely the time when the Younger Dryas began. These marine records provide independent confirmation that massive quantities of fresh water entered the North Atlantic at exactly the right time to have triggered the circulation shutdown. The isotopic signature of the floodwaters has been preserved in ice cores from Greenland, providing yet another line of evidence for the catastrophic drainage event. The chemical composition of precipitation changes dramatically when large volumes of fresh water with distinctive isotopic characteristics enter the atmospheric circulation system. The Greenland ice cores show exactly the kind of changes that would be expected from a massive freshwater pulse in the North Atlantic. The aftermath of the circulation shutdown extended far beyond the immediate cooling effects. The disruption of normal weather patterns created a cascade of environmental changes that affected ecosystems around the world. The monsoon systems that bring vital rainfall to much of Africa and Asia were weakened as the energy gradients that drive these circulation patterns were reduced. Drought conditions appeared in regions that had previously enjoyed reliable precipitation. In the tropics, the effects of the northern cooling were paradoxically warming in some regions as the global circulation patterns reorganize. The thermal equator, the zone of maximum heating that drives much of the world's weather, shifted southward as the North Atlantic cooled. This brought increased rainfall to some tropical regions while creating drought conditions in others, reorganizing ecosystems that had been stable for thousands of years. The Lake Agassiz event demonstrates how seemingly local geological processes can have global consequences through the interconnected systems that regulate Earth's climate. A dam failure in what is now central Canada triggered climate changes that affected human communities from Europe to Asia to Africa. The lesson of this event resonates strongly in the modern world, where human activities are creating similar perturbations in global climate systems. The recovery of Atlantic circulation after the Younger Dryas required more than 1,000 years, suggesting that such shutdowns, once initiated, can persist for extended periods, even after the initial triggering event has passed. This has profound implications for understanding both past climate changes and potential future climate disruptions. The stability of modern climate depends on the continued operation of circulation systems that could potentially be disrupted by ongoing changes in ice sheet stability and freshwater inputs. The Lake Agassiz dam failure serves as a dramatic example of how complex Earth systems can experience sudden, catastrophic transitions between different stable states. The gradual warming that had characterized the end of the Ice Age was not simply reversed, but was replaced by an entirely different climate regime that persisted for more than a millennium. Understanding these sudden transitions, or tipping points, has become crucial for predicting how modern climate systems might respond to ongoing human-induced changes. The human survivors of the Lake Agassiz catastrophe could not have understood the global implications of what they had witnessed, but they carried with them the memory of a world transformed in the span of a single lifetime. Their descendants would tell stories of great floods, of the time when the waters rose and fell and the world grew cold, passing down through oral tradition the echo of one of the most. On a clear night 12,900 years ago, the stars that had guided human migrations for thousands of generations suddenly blazed with an intensity that should have been impossible. Across the dome of the sky, celestial fires burned brighter than anyone alive had ever seen, casting shadows on the frozen landscape below. Then, without warning, those same stars began to fall. Not the gentle meteors that had always decorated the night sky, but massive objects that screamed through the atmosphere with the fury of angry gods, trailing tails of fire that turned night into day. The impact hypothesis for the Younger Dryas presents one of the most controversial and compelling explanations for the sudden climate catastrophe that gripped the Earth 12,900 years ago. According to this theory, a fragmented comet or asteroid, possibly originating from the breakup of a much larger object, struck the Earth with devastating consequences. The evidence for this cosmic catastrophe comes not from a single massive crater, but from a scattered field of impacts that devastated the North American ice sheet and triggered a cascade of environmental changes that plunged the world back into Ice Age conditions. The story begins in the outer reaches of the solar system, where comets spend most of their existence in the cold darkness beyond the orbit of Pluto. These ancient remnants of the solar system's formation are composed primarily of ice, rock, and organic compounds, frozen into solid masses that can range in size from small boulders to objects hundreds of kilometers across. For billions of years, they orbit in the Kuiper Belt and Oort cloud, disturbed only occasionally by gravitational interactions that send them tumbling toward the inner solar system. The comet that may have caused the Younger Dryas catastrophe was likely a massive object that entered the inner solar system on a trajectory that would bring it dangerously close to Earth. As it approached the Sun, the increasing heat began to break down its structure, causing it to fragment into numerous smaller pieces. This fragmentation process is well documented in modern astronomy, with comets like Shoemaker-Levy 9 providing dramatic examples of how these objects can break apart under gravitational and thermal stresses. The fragments of this ancient comet continued their journey toward Earth, now spread across a much wider area, but still following essentially the same orbital path. When they finally encountered our planet's atmosphere, they arrived not as a single massive impact, but as a swarm of objects ranging in size from house-sized boulders to fragments many kilometers across. The larger pieces survived their passage through the atmosphere to strike the surface with explosive force, while smaller fragments exploded in the air, creating fireballs that released enormous amounts of energy. The evidence for this cosmic bombardment comes from multiple sources, each providing pieces of a puzzle that researchers are still working to complete. The most compelling evidence consists of microscopic diamonds found in sediment layers that date precisely to the beginning of the Younger Dryas. These diamonds, known as nanodiamonds, can only be formed under conditions of extreme pressure and temperature that are typically associated with cosmic impacts or nuclear explosions. The nanodiamonds found in Younger Dryas boundary layers are not the kind that form naturally in the Earth's mantle and are brought to the surface through volcanic processes. Instead, they show the distinctive characteristics of impact diamonds, formed when carbon-bearing materials are subjected to the intense shock waves generated by high-velocity collisions. The distribution of these diamonds across multiple continents suggests that the impacts occurred over a wide geographic area, consistent with the fragmented comet hypothesis. Additional evidence comes in the form of magnetic spherules, tiny metallic particles that form when rock and metal are melted and then rapidly cooled in the extreme conditions of impact events. These spherules are found in the same sediment layers as the nanodiamonds and show chemical compositions that are consistent with the melting of terrestrial rocks under impact conditions. The spherules contain high concentrations of elements like iridium and osmium that are rare in Earth's crust but common in extraterrestrial objects. Perhaps the most dramatic evidence for the impact hypothesis comes from the widespread occurrence of a carbon-rich layer known as the black mat. This dark sediment layer appears at sites across North America at precisely the time boundary between the warming period and the Younger Dryas. The black mat contains massive quantities of carbon in the form of charcoal and other burned organic materials, suggesting that enormous wildfires swept across the continent at the time of the supposed impacts. The scale of these fires would have been unprecedented in human history. Computer models suggest that impact-generated fireballs could have ignited vegetation across millions of square kilometers, creating continent-spanning wildfires that consumed entire ecosystems in a matter of days or weeks. The smoke and soot from these fires would have been lofted high into the atmosphere, creating a pall of darkness that blocked sunlight and contributed to the rapid cooling that characterized the beginning of the Younger Dryas. The biological evidence for massive fires comes from fossil pollen records that show a sudden shift from forest vegetation to grassland species at the Younger Dryas boundary. This transition, which occurred across vast areas of North America, is consistent with the destruction of forest ecosystems by fire, followed by the gradual recovery of fire-adapted plant communities. The timing of this vegetation change matches perfectly with the other indicators of cosmic impact, strengthening the case for a causal relationship. Archaeological evidence adds another dimension to the impact hypothesis. Many North American archaeological sites show a distinct break in human occupation at the Younger Dryas boundary, with the sophisticated Clovis culture disappearing abruptly and being replaced by different, often simpler technologies. This cultural discontinuity could reflect the devastating effects of impact-generated environmental changes on human populations across the continent. The Clovis people, who had successfully adapted to life in late Ice Age North America, left behind distinctive stone tools and evidence of sophisticated hunting techniques that allowed them to thrive in challenging environments. The sudden disappearance of Clovis technology and its replacement by different cultural traditions suggests a major disruption in the transmission of knowledge and skills that had been developing for thousands of years. Some researchers have suggested that the impact event may have directly affected human populations through the environmental catastrophe it triggered. The massive wildfires alone would have made large areas of the continent uninhabitable for extended periods. The destruction of plant and animal communities would have eliminated the resource base that supported human populations. Climate changes, triggered by the impact, would have created additional challenges for survivors attempting to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. The geographic distribution of impact evidence shows interesting patterns that may reveal the trajectory and nature of the cosmic bombardment. The highest concentrations of nanodiamonds and other impact indicators are found in eastern North America, particularly around the Great Lakes region. This pattern suggests that the impacts may have been concentrated in this area, possibly because the fragments followed a trajectory that brought them down primarily over the North American ice sheet. The ice sheet itself would have played a crucial role in the impact event. Unlike impacts on solid rock, which create well-defined craters that can persist for millions of years, impacts on ice sheets produce very different effects. The ice would have absorbed much of the impact energy through melting and vaporization, creating massive quantities of water vapor and steam rather than the rock vapor typically associated with impact events. The interaction between cosmic fragments and the ice sheet could have triggered catastrophic ice dynamics that contributed to the climate changes of the Younger Dryas. The sudden injection of enormous amounts of energy into the ice sheet could have caused widespread melting and the catastrophic drainage of glacial lakes. This mechanism could help explain how a cosmic impact might have triggered the shutdown of Atlantic Ocean circulation that many researchers believe was responsible for the Younger Dryas cooling. The airburst hypothesis represents a variation of the impact theory that focuses on the effects of fragments that exploded in the atmosphere rather than reaching the ground. These airbursts, similar to the Tunguska event that devastated Siberian forests in 1908, could have released enormous amounts of energy without creating visible impact craters. The Tunguska event, caused by an object perhaps 50 meters across, flattened 2,000 square kilometers of forest. Objects hundreds of times larger could have created destruction on a continental scale. The atmospheric effects of multiple large airbursts occurring simultaneously across North America would have been catastrophic. The fireballs created by these explosions would have generated intense thermal radiation, capable of igniting vegetation across vast areas. The shock waves would have flattened forests and created hurricane-force winds that spread the fires even further. The debris lofted into the atmosphere would have included both cosmic material and terrestrial matter blasted upward by the explosions. Critics of the impact hypothesis point to several problems with the evidence and interpretation. They argue that the nanodiamonds found in Younger Dryas sediments could have been formed by processes other than cosmic impact, including wildfires or volcanic activity. The magnetic spherules, they suggest, might be the result of human activities such as metalworking or the burning of meteoritic material that was already present on the Earth's surface. The absence of a clear impact crater from this period presents perhaps the greatest challenge to the impact hypothesis. Proponents argue that impacts on the ice sheet would not have created permanent craters, and that any craters formed in other areas might have been subsequently eroded or hidden by later geological processes. They point to the recently discovered Hiawatha crater in Greenland as an example of how impact features can remain hidden for thousands of years. The Hiawatha crater, discovered beneath the Greenland ice sheet through radar imaging, represents a significant impact event that may have occurred during the Pleistocene period. While the exact age of this crater is still being determined, its discovery demonstrates that large impact events have occurred in the region during the time frame relevant to the Younger Dryas. The crater is approximately 31 kilometers in diameter, indicating that it was formed by an object at least a kilometer across. Alternative explanations for the Younger Dryas continue to compete with the impact hypothesis. The freshwater pulse from glacial lake drainage remains the leading alternative theory, supported by extensive evidence for the catastrophic release of meltwater into the North Atlantic. Volcanic activity has also been proposed as a possible trigger, with some researchers pointing to evidence for increased volcanism during the transition period. The debate over the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis reflects broader challenges in understanding how Earth systems respond to external forcing. The complexity of climate and environmental interactions makes it difficult to isolate the effects of any single event, whether cosmic, geological, or hydrological. Multiple factors may have combined to create the perfect storm of conditions that triggered the Younger Dryas catastrophe. Recent advances in analytical techniques have provided new tools for investigating the impact hypothesis. High-resolution mass spectrometry can detect trace amounts of extraterrestrial materials in sediment samples. Microscopic analysis of shocked minerals can reveal the pressure conditions under which they formed. These techniques are gradually building a more detailed picture of what happened at the Younger Dryas boundary. The implications of the impact hypothesis extend far beyond the specific case of the Younger Dryas. If confirmed, it would demonstrate that cosmic impacts can trigger rapid climate changes through complex environmental feedback mechanisms. This has obvious relevance for understanding how modern Earth systems might respond to similar events, whether natural or human-induced. The psychological and cultural impact of a cosmic catastrophe on human populations would have been profound. Unlike gradual climate changes that could be adapted to over generations, a cosmic impact would have represented a sudden, inexplicable disaster that challenged every assumption about the stability and predictability of the natural world. The trauma of such an event might have influenced human cultural development for millennia. The fragmented nature of the proposed impact provides a model for understanding how cosmic catastrophes might unfold. Rather than a single devastating blow, the Earth may have experienced a sustained bombardment lasting days, weeks, or even months. This would have created a prolonged period of environmental chaos as each new impact added to the destruction while preventing recovery from previous events. The seasonal timing of the impact may have been crucial to its environmental effects. Computer models suggest that impacts occurring during the Northern Hemisphere summer would have had maximum effect on vegetation and fire generation. The dry conditions and abundant plant biomass of late summer would have provided optimal conditions for the continent-spanning wildfires that the evidence suggests occurred at the Younger Dryas boundary. The long-term effects of the proposed cosmic catastrophe extended far beyond the immediate destruction. The injection of massive quantities of debris into the atmosphere would have affected global climate patterns for years or decades. The destruction of vegetation would have altered carbon cycling and atmospheric composition. The disruption of ecosystems would have triggered cascading effects that continued long after the fires had burned out and the debris had settled. Modern space agencies monitor the skies for potentially hazardous asteroids and comets, driven in part by recognition that cosmic impacts represent one of the few natural disasters capable of causing truly global catastrophes. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, whether ultimately confirmed or refuted, serves as a reminder that Earth exists in a cosmic environment where catastrophic events are not only possible, but inevitable on geological timescales. The human survivors of a cosmic catastrophe would have faced challenges that tested every aspect of their survival skills and cultural resilience. The immediate effects of impact-generated fires, climate disruption, and ecosystem collapse would have been followed by years or decades of environmental instability as Earth systems slowly recovered from the trauma. Understanding how our ancestors survived such challenges provides insights into human adaptability and the factors that enable civilizations to persist through catastrophic changes. The sun rose later each day, casting a pale, weak light across landscapes that had forgotten the meaning of warmth. In the scattered camps of human survivors, the rhythm of life had slowed to match the eternal winter that now governed their world. Children who had never known spring grew into adults whose memories contained only snow, ice, and the endless struggle to find enough fuel to keep the fires burning through another frozen night. This was life in the heart of the Younger Dryas, when winter had become not a season, but a permanent condition that stretched across generations. In what would one day be called Northern Europe, communities that had once migrated seasonally between summer and winter camps found themselves trapped in a single mode of existence. The summer camps, built to take advantage of warm weather and abundant resources, had been abandoned as the brief growing seasons became too short and unpredictable to support settled life. Only the winter camps remained viable, their heavy construction and proximity to fuel sources making them the sole option for survival in the New World Order. These winter camps bore little resemblance to the relatively comfortable settlements of the warming period. Every aspect of their design was dictated by the single overriding imperative of heat conservation. Dwellings were built partially underground, taking advantage of the Earth's thermal mass to moderate the extreme cold. Multiple families often shared single structures, using body heat and shared fires to create microclimates warm enough to sustain life. The daily routine in these communities revolved entirely around the maintenance of fire. Each dawn brought the critical task of nursing the banked coals back to life, adding carefully hoarded fuel, and ensuring that the precious flames would last another day. Fire was no longer simply a tool for cooking and warmth, but the absolute foundation upon which survival depended. A family whose fire died faced death within hours during the worst cold spells. Fuel gathering consumed enormous amounts of time and energy. The abundant wood supplies of the warming period had long since been exhausted in most areas, forcing communities to travel ever greater distances to find burnable material. Every scrap of organic matter became precious. Dried grass, animal dung, bones, bark, and even hair were collected and stored against the unforgiving cold. Children learned to identify potential fuel sources before they could properly walk, understanding instinctively that their survival depended on this constant vigilance. The social hierarchies that governed these survival communities were based entirely on practical contributions to group welfare. The most respected individuals were those who possessed skills essential for keeping everyone alive. The firekeepers who could coax flames from the dampest tinder, the hunters who could find game in the barren landscapes, the shelter builders who could create warm spaces from minimal materials, and the weather readers who could predict when conditions might briefly improve enough to allow travel or major hunts. Leadership during the Younger Dryas required a combination of practical competence and psychological strength that few individuals possessed. Leaders needed to make life and death decisions about resource allocation, migration timing, and risk management, while maintaining group morale in circumstances that tested human endurance to its limits. They had to balance the immediate needs of survival against long-term planning for an uncertain future, often making choices that meant some individuals would not survive so that others might. The role of elderly community members changed dramatically during this period. While their physical contributions to survival activities declined, their knowledge became more valuable than ever. Elders who remembered survival techniques from the distant past, who could predict weather patterns from subtle environmental cues, or who possessed detailed mental maps of territories and resource locations, became living treasures whose wisdom could mean the difference between survival and extinction for entire communities. Children born during the Younger Dryas developed characteristics that distinguished them from previous generations. They grew up with an intuitive understanding of scarcity that influenced every aspect of their behavior. They learned to eat slowly and completely, wasting nothing. They developed the ability to remain motionless for extended periods, conserving energy when activity was unnecessary. Their play activities all served practical purposes, teaching skills they would need as adults in the harsh world they inhabited. The psychological development of these children was shaped by the constant presence of death and the knowledge that survival was never guaranteed. They learned to form intense but pragmatic social bonds, understanding that cooperation was essential, but that circumstances might force difficult choices about who could be helped and who might have to be abandoned. This created personality types characterized by emotional resilience, practical problem-solving abilities, and a deep appreciation for any moment of comfort or security. Education in Younger Dryas communities focused exclusively on survival skills and knowledge transmission. Children learned through constant observation and participation in the activities that kept their communities alive. By adolescence, they possessed expertise in areas like fire management, food preservation, weather prediction, and emergency medicine that would have impressed modern specialists. This education was necessarily hands-on and immediate, as mistakes could have fatal consequences. The languages spoken during this period evolved to accommodate the realities of survival in extreme conditions. Vocabularies expanded to include precise terms for different types of cold, varieties of snow and ice, stages of hypothermia, and subtle environmental indicators that could predict weather changes. Communication systems became highly efficient, with standardized signals for common survival situations that could be understood even when verbal communication was impossible. Artistic expression during the Younger Dryas served primarily functional purposes while still maintaining elements of aesthetic beauty that spoke to fundamental human needs for meaning and creativity. Decorative elements on tools and clothing often incorporated symbols related to survival, protection, and hope for better conditions. Storytelling traditions preserved practical knowledge while providing psychological comfort through narratives that celebrated human resilience and adaptation. The religious and spiritual systems that developed during this period reflected both the harsh realities of daily life and the human need for meaning in the face of seemingly endless suffering. Spiritual practices often focused on rituals designed to ensure survival, with elaborate ceremonies surrounding activities like firemaking, hunting, and the preservation of food. These rituals serve both practical and psychological functions, reinforcing best practices while providing emotional comfort and group cohesion. Burial practices during the Younger Dryas reveal the complex attitudes these communities held toward death and survival. Bodies were often interred with tools and supplies that might be needed in the afterlife, but the burial sites were also chosen and constructed to serve practical purposes for the living. Grave goods included fire-making materials, food supplies, and warm clothing, reflecting both spiritual beliefs and the understanding that survival resources were precious even in death. The medical knowledge that developed during this period was remarkable for its sophistication and effectiveness under extreme conditions. Communities learned to treat frostbite, hypothermia, malnutrition, and injuries using only natural materials and traditional techniques. They developed understanding of human physiology that allowed them to recognize early signs of serious health problems and intervene before conditions became life-threatening. Surgical procedures performed during the Younger Dryas required extraordinary skill, given the limitations of available tools and materials. Operations were conducted using stone knives, bone needles, and plant-based medicines. Yet survival rates suggest that practitioners had developed techniques that were surprisingly effective. The psychological aspects of medical treatment were also sophisticated, with healers understanding the importance of maintaining patient morale and hope during recovery. The clothing technologies that emerged during the Younger Dryas represent some of the most advanced cold weather gear ever developed using traditional materials. These garments incorporated multiple layers of insulation, sophisticated ventilation systems, and design features that maximize warmth while allowing for necessary mobility. The construction techniques required enormous skill and represented the accumulated knowledge of generations of survival specialists. Footwear design reached particular heights of sophistication during this period. Boots and shoes needed to provide insulation, waterproofing, and traction while being constructed entirely from materials obtained through hunting and gathering. The designs that emerged incorporated multiple layers of different materials, each serving specific functions in the overall system that kept feet warm and functional in conditions that would defeat modern equipment. Food preservation and storage techniques became matters of life and death during the Younger Dryas. Communities developed methods for smoking, drying, fermenting, and freezing foods that could keep them edible for extended periods. These techniques required precise understanding of timing, temperature, and environmental conditions, all achieved through careful observation and experimentation across generations. The hunting strategies employed during this period required unprecedented levels of cooperation and efficiency. Game animals were scarce and widely scattered, making every hunt a critical operation whose success or failure could determine the survival of entire communities. Hunting parties needed to coordinate their activities across vast territories, using communication systems and strategic planning that rivaled military operations in their complexity. Tracking abilities during the Younger Dryas reached levels that seem almost supernatural to modern observers. Hunters could follow animal trails across snow and ice for days, reading subtle signs that revealed not only the passage of their prey, but detailed information about the animal's condition, behavior, and likely destinations. This knowledge was essential for successful hunts in an environment where opportunities were rare and failure meant starvation. Weapon technology evolved to meet the specific challenges of hunting in extreme cold conditions. Spear points needed to remain sharp and functional at temperatures that would shatter inferior materials. Bowstrings had to maintain their elasticity despite freezing conditions. Hafting techniques had to ensure that weapon components would not separate during critical moments when a successful kill was the difference between feast and famine. Fishing became increasingly important in regions where terrestrial game was scarce. Communities developed techniques for ice fishing that allowed them to exploit aquatic resources even when surface waters were frozen solid. These methods required sophisticated understanding of fish behavior, ice conditions, and seasonal patterns that affected the availability of different species. The trap technologies developed during the Younger Dryas were marvels of engineering that allowed communities to capture animals with minimal energy expenditure. These devices used principles of mechanics and animal psychology to create automated hunting systems that could operate without human presence. The most sophisticated traps could capture large animals alive, allowing communities to maintain fresh meat supplies during extended periods when hunting was impossible. Plant gathering during this period required encyclopedic knowledge of botanical resources that could provide nutrition even under extreme conditions. Gatherers learned to identify edible plants buried under snow, to process toxic species, to make them safe for consumption, and to concentrate nutrients from marginal food sources. This knowledge represented the accumulated wisdom of generations of survival specialists. The seasonal rhythms that governed Younger Dryas life were extreme compared to anything experienced during previous periods. Communities had to plan activities around winters that could last 8 or 9 months, with only brief periods of slightly warmer weather that provided opportunities for essential activities like migration, major hunts, and resource gathering. The timing of these activities was critical, as miscalculation could leave a community without adequate resources for the long winter ahead. Communication between distant communities became essential for survival as groups shared information about resource availability, weather patterns, and safe travel routes. These communication networks required standardized protocols and symbols that could be understood across cultural and linguistic boundaries. The information exchange that resulted was crucial for the survival of isolated communities that might otherwise have exhausted their local resources. The psychological resilience required to survive the Younger Dryas was extraordinary. Community members needed to maintain hope and determination through years of hardship that would have broken the spirit of most modern individuals. The mental health strategies that developed during this period included elaborate support systems, stress relief techniques, and meaning-making frameworks that help people endure seemingly endless suffering. The legacy of Younger Dryas survival strategies would influence human culture for millennia. The communities that emerged from this period had developed characteristics of resilience, adaptability, and cooperation that would serve them well when conditions finally improved. Their descendants would carry forward knowledge and cultural traits that reflected the harsh lessons learned during humanity's most recent encounter with climate catastrophe. In the depths of caves scattered across Europe and Asia, ancient artists worked by flickering firelight to record images that would outlast empires and civilizations. Their paintings, carved into stone walls with pigments made from ochre, charcoal, and blood, tell a story that transcends the immediate concerns of survival. These are the visual chronicles of the Younger Dryas, documenting not just the physical reality of life during the Great Cooling, but the psychological and spiritual responses of communities struggling to understand why their world had been transformed from paradise into purgatory. The cave art of the Younger Dryas period differs markedly from the paintings created during the earlier warming phase, where previous generations had depicted the abundance of their world through scenes of massive herds and successful hunts. The artists of the cold period focused on themes of scarcity, danger, and survival. Their animal figures are often solitary rather than grouped, emphasizing the isolation and difficulty of finding prey in the transformed landscape. Human figures, rarely depicted in earlier art, begin to appear more frequently, often shown in positions that suggest struggle, supplication, or desperate action. The symbolic vocabulary that developed during this period reveals sophisticated attempts to understand and influence the forces that had brought catastrophe to the human world. New symbols appear repeatedly across different sites and cultures, spirals that may represent the cyclical nature of climate and seasons, zigzag patterns that could symbolize lightning or water, and concentric circles that might represent the sun or other celestial bodies. These symbols were not merely decorative, but served as components of complex meaning-making systems that helped communities interpret their transformed reality. Hand stencils created by blowing pigment over hands pressed against cave walls become more numerous during the Younger Dryas period. These images, found in caves across Europe and Asia, represent one of humanity's most universal art forms and may have served multiple functions during the crisis period. Beyond their artistic value, hand stencils could have functioned as signatures or territorial markers, as components of ritual practices, or simply as assertions of human presence and continuity in the face of overwhelming natural forces. The oral traditions that developed during the Younger Dryas created narrative frameworks that would influence human storytelling for millennia. These stories served multiple functions beyond entertainment, acting as repositories for practical survival knowledge, psychological coping mechanisms, and explanatory systems that helped communities understand their transformed world. The themes that emerged during this period would become central to human mythology. Stories of golden ages lost to cosmic catastrophe, heroes who survived impossible challenges, and the promise of eventual redemption and renewal. Flood myths, which appear in cultures around the world, may preserve memories of the dramatic environmental changes that characterized the Younger Dryas period. These narratives often describe a time when the world was overwhelmed by water, ice, or other natural forces, followed by the survival of a small group of humans who become the ancestors of all subsequent peoples. The universal nature of these stories suggests that they may reflect actual historical events that were preserved in oral tradition and passed down through thousands of generations. The concept of cyclical time, fundamental to many religious and philosophical systems, may have originated during the Younger Dryas as communities struggled to understand the alternation between warm and cold periods. The experience of witnessing dramatic climate reversals would have challenged linear concepts of progress in development, leading to worldviews that emphasize recurring patterns and the possibility of both decline and renewal. This cyclical understanding of time would become central to many of the world's major religious traditions. Stories of great winters that last for years or decades appear in mythologies from cultures that had no apparent contact with each other during historical periods. These narratives often describe supernatural causes for extended cold periods, suggesting that communities developed explanatory frameworks that attributed climate catastrophes to divine displeasure, cosmic battles, or the actions of supernatural beings. The Norse concept of Fimbulwinter, a winter that lasts for 3 years and precedes the end of the world, may preserve memories of actual climatic events experienced by ancient peoples. The theme of survival through superior knowledge or moral virtue appears repeatedly in Younger Dryas-era traditions. Heroes in these stories often succeed not through physical strength or weapons, but through wisdom, foresight, and adherence to traditional values. These narratives serve both as entertainment and as instruction manuals for survival, encoding practical knowledge about resource management, community cooperation, and crisis leadership within memorable story frameworks. The development of shamanic traditions during the Younger Dryas reflects attempts to develop spiritual technologies for dealing with unprecedented challenges. Shamans served as intermediaries between human communities and the natural forces that govern survival, using altered states of consciousness to access knowledge and power that could help their people endure the crisis. The techniques they developed, including the use of rhythmic drumming, controlled breathing, and psychoactive plants, created religious practices that would persist for thousands of years. Trance states and mystical experiences became important components of Younger Dryas spirituality as communities sought supernatural assistance for their survival challenges. The extreme stress and altered brain chemistry that result from prolonged exposure to cold, hunger, and fear can induce altered states of consciousness that were interpreted as divine communication or spiritual revelation. These experiences became the foundation for elaborate religious systems that helped communities maintain hope and social cohesion during the darkest periods. The concept of sacrifice, both literal and metaphorical, took on new significance during the Younger Dryas as communities were forced to make difficult choices about resource allocation and group survival. Religious practices developed that ritualized these necessary sacrifices, creating frameworks for understanding why some individuals had to suffer or die so that others might live. These traditions helped communities process the psychological trauma of making life and death decisions about their own members. Ancestor veneration, which appears in many Younger Dryas-era cultures, served multiple functions in communities struggling with survival challenges. The memory of ancestors who had lived during better times provided both inspiration and practical guidance for dealing with current difficulties. Ancestor spirits were often believed to possess knowledge about survival techniques, resource locations, and future climate patterns that could help their descendants navigate the ongoing crisis. The tradition of preserving and transmitting specialized knowledge through elite lineages may have originated during the Younger Dryas, when certain types of expertise became literally matters of life and death for entire communities. Families or clans that possessed crucial survival skills would have had strong incentives to maintain these abilities within their groups, leading to the development of hereditary specialist classes that would characterize many later societies. The instruments developed during this period often served dual purposes as musical devices and practical tools. Bone flutes could provide entertainment, but also served as signaling devices for long-distance communication. Drums made from animal hides provided rhythm for ceremonies, but could also be used for message transmission across difficult terrain. The multifunctional nature of these objects reflects the practical constraints that governed all aspects of Younger Dryas material culture. Dance traditions that developed during the Younger Dryas often incorporated movements that served practical training purposes. Ceremonial dances taught hunting techniques, survival skills, and coordinated group activities, while also providing spiritual and social benefits. These performances created opportunities for skill transfer between experienced practitioners and younger community members, while reinforcing social bonds and cultural identity. The storytelling traditions that emerged during this period created sophisticated information storage and transmission systems that preserved crucial knowledge without requiring written language. Epic narratives encoded detailed information about territorial boundaries, resource locations, climate patterns, and survival techniques within memorable story frameworks that could be accurately transmitted across generations. The bards and storytellers who maintained these traditions became essential components of community survival infrastructure. The concept of taboo, fundamental to many religious and social systems, may have originated as a practical survival mechanism during the Younger Dryas. Behaviors that could endanger group survival became ritualized as forbidden activities, with supernatural sanctions providing enforcement mechanisms that ensured compliance even when immediate practical consequences were not apparent. These taboo systems help maintain group discipline and resource conservation during critical periods. Initiation rituals that appear in many cultures may preserve elements of the survival training that was essential during the Younger Dryas. These ceremonies often involve tests of endurance, skill demonstrations, and knowledge transmission that mirror the competencies required for survival in extreme environments. The psychological conditioning provided by initiation rituals helped prepare young people for the harsh realities they would face as adult community members. The development of complex kinship systems during the Younger Dryas reflects the need for sophisticated social organization to manage resource sharing and mutual assistance during crisis periods. Extended family networks provided insurance against local resource failures and created obligations for mutual support that helped ensure no community would face disaster alone. These kinship systems often incorporated adoption practices that allowed for the integration of refugees and survivors from devastated communities. Trade relationships between communities took on new importance during the Younger Dryas as groups specialized in different survival strategies and developed expertise with particular resources or technologies. The exchange networks that developed during this period required sophisticated systems for establishing trust, negotiating agreements, and maintaining relationships across vast distances and cultural boundaries. These trade systems would become the foundation for many later economic and political developments. The concept of hospitality, central to many cultural traditions, may have originated as a survival strategy during the Younger Dryas, when travelers faced life-threatening dangers and communities depended on maintaining relationships with distant groups. Elaborate protocols for receiving and caring for strangers serve both practical and spiritual functions, ensuring that essential information and resources could flow between communities while also demonstrating adherence to moral principles that helped maintain social cohesion. Seasonal ceremonies that appear in many traditional cultures often preserve elements of the survival calendar that was essential during the Younger Dryas. These rituals marked critical transitions in the annual cycle when specific survival activities needed to be undertaken, resources harvested, or preparations made for challenging periods. The ceremonial framework helped ensure that essential activities were completed on schedule while also providing psychological and social benefits. The tradition of prophecy and prediction that appears in many religious systems may reflect the crucial importance of environmental forecasting during the Younger Dryas. Communities that could accurately predict weather patterns, resource availability, and environmental changes had enormous survival advantages over those that could not. The individuals who possessed these forecasting abilities became revered figures whose spiritual authority reflected their practical value to community survival. Healing traditions that developed during the Younger Dryas incorporated both practical medical knowledge and spiritual practices designed to address the psychological trauma that resulted from prolonged exposure to crisis conditions. These healing systems recognized the interconnection between physical and mental health and developed holistic approaches to treatment that addressed both the symptoms of survival stress and its underlying causes. The concept of purification, central to many religious traditions, may have originated as a practical health measure during the Younger Dryas, when communities faced increased disease pressure from malnutrition, crowding, and stress. Ritual cleansing practices serve both hygienic and psychological functions, helping maintain physical health while also providing symbolic frameworks for processing guilt, trauma, and other negative emotions associated with survival activities. The development of elaborate funeral traditions during the Younger Dryas reflects both practical necessities and spiritual responses to the increased mortality that characterized this period. Communities needed efficient methods for disposing of bodies in frozen ground, while also providing psychological closure for survivors who face the constant presence of death. These funeral practices often incorporated elements designed to ensure that the deceased would not return to demand resources from the living, while also honoring their contributions to community survival. The concept of the afterlife that appears in many religious traditions may have been influenced by the experiences of Younger Dryas communities who lived in landscapes that seemed frozen in time. The idea of a realm beyond ordinary existence where souls could find peace and abundance may have provided psychological comfort to people whose daily reality involved constant struggle and deprivation. These afterlife concepts often incorporated imagery of warmth, light, and plenty that contrasted sharply with the harsh conditions of earthly existence. Memorial traditions that developed during this period served multiple functions beyond simple remembrance of the dead. Memorial sites often marked important resource locations, territorial boundaries, or navigation landmarks that were essential for community survival. The spiritual significance attached to these locations helped ensure their preservation and maintenance across generations, while also providing practical benefits for territorial organization and resource management. The tradition of keeping sacred fires that appears in many cultures may preserve memories of the crucial importance of fire maintenance during the Younger Dryas. These eternal flames serve both practical and symbolic functions, providing backup ignition sources for communities whose survival depended on continuous fire, while also representing hope for eventual renewal and improvement. The elaborate rituals surrounding sacred fire maintenance reflected the life and death importance of fire technology during the crisis period. Seasonal festivals that celebrate the return of light and warmth appear in cultures around the world and may preserve memories of the profound psychological impact of brief, warm periods during the Younger Dryas. These celebrations often incorporate themes of renewal, rebirth, and hope that reflect the emotional significance of any respite from the harsh conditions that characterize most of the year. The timing of these festivals often corresponds to astronomical events that mark seasonal transitions. The development of divination practices during the Younger Dryas reflects attempts to gain supernatural insight into future conditions that could affect survival planning. Communities that could accurately predict weather patterns, resource availability, and other environmental factors had enormous advantages over those that could not. Divination systems provided frameworks for processing environmental information and making decisions about migration, resource allocation, and survival strategy. The concept of spiritual pollution that appears in many religious systems may have originated as a practical health measure during the Younger Dryas, when communities faced increased disease pressure and resource scarcity. Behaviors that could endanger group health or survival became ritualized as spiritually dangerous activities, with purification requirements providing incentives for adherence to practices that promoted community welfare. The tradition of pilgrimage that appears in many religious systems may preserve memories of the long-distance travel that was often necessary during the Younger Dryas to reach resource locations or seasonal gathering sites. These journeys, undertaken despite enormous hardships and dangers, became spiritualized as quests for divine favor or spiritual enlightenment. The physical challenges of pilgrimage may have served as preparation for the survival challenges that characterized ordinary life during the crisis period. The tradition of sacred geography that appears in many cultures may preserve detailed knowledge of territorial organization and resource distribution that was essential during the Younger Dryas. Sacred sites often marked important resource locations, territorial boundaries, or navigation landmarks, while also serving as repositories for the detailed environmental knowledge that communities needed for survival. The spiritual significance attached to these locations helped ensure their preservation and maintenance across generations. The concept of spiritual hierarchy that characterizes many religious systems may reflect the practical necessity for clear leadership structures during the Younger Dryas when communities faced constant survival challenges. Spiritual authority often coincided with practical competence in essential survival skills, creating integrated leadership systems that combine practical expertise with religious authority. These hierarchical systems helped ensure effective decision-making during crisis situations while also providing frameworks for knowledge transmission and social organization. The development of elaborate ritual systems during the Younger Dryas served multiple functions that went beyond simple religious observance. Rituals provided opportunities for skill transfer, social bonding, and psychological processing of trauma, while also creating frameworks for community decision-making and conflict resolution. The repetitive nature of ritual activities helped maintain social stability during periods of extreme stress, while also preserving essential cultural knowledge. The tradition of seasonal migration that appears in many cultures may preserve memories of the movement patterns that were essential for survival during the Younger Dryas. These migrations often followed routes that maximized access to seasonal resources while minimizing exposure to dangerous conditions. The spiritual significance attached to these journeys helped ensure their continuation across generations, while also providing frameworks for territorial organization and resource management. The concept of spiritual transformation through ordeal that appears in many religious traditions may preserve memories of the extreme challenges that characterized ordinary life during the Younger Dryas. The idea that suffering could lead to spiritual enlightenment or supernatural power may have provided psychological frameworks for processing the trauma and hardship that were unavoidable aspects of survival during the crisis period. The cultural legacy of the Younger Dryas extends far beyond the specific survival strategies and spiritual systems that developed during the crisis itself. The communities that emerged from this period had been fundamentally transformed by their experiences, carrying forward cultural traits and knowledge systems that would influence human development for thousands of years. Their descendants would build the first permanent settlements, develop agriculture, and create the foundations of civilization. But they would never forget the lessons learned during the 1,000 years when winter ruled the world, and survival itself was the highest achievement of human culture. The first hints of change came not as dramatic transformation, but as subtle shifts that only the most experienced weather readers among the scattered human communities could detect. After 1,000 years of relentless cold, the patterns that had governed life for countless generations began to show almost imperceptible variations. Winters that had lasted 9 months were ending a few weeks earlier. Springs that had been brief, tentative affairs lasting only weeks were stretching into months. The ice that had seemed eternal was beginning, slowly and quietly, to release its grip on the world. In the camps scattered across the northern landscapes, elders who had never known anything but the endless winter began to notice changes that seemed too small to matter, but too consistent to ignore. The snow that fell in autumn was slightly different in texture and density. The winds that brought the bitter cold from the north carried subtle scents and temperatures that suggested something was shifting in the vast ice fields beyond the horizon. Animals that had not been seen for generations began to appear in territories where they had been absent for so long that their existence had passed into legend. The children born during the later phases of the Younger Dryas had never heard their grandparents' stories of warmth and abundance described as anything more than myths and fairy tales. For them, the world of ice and scarcity was not a catastrophe, but simply reality. They had developed sensory capabilities and survival instincts that were perfectly adapted to their harsh environment, but they lacked the comparative framework that would have allowed them to recognize that their world was beginning to change in fundamental ways. The process of warming that would eventually end the Younger Dryas was not a simple reversal of the cooling that had initiated it. The climate system that had been locked into the cold state for over a millennium had developed its own internal stability mechanisms that resisted change. Ice sheets had advanced to positions where they generated their own weather patterns. Ocean currents had stabilized in configurations that reinforced the cold conditions. Vegetation communities had adapted to short growing seasons and harsh conditions, creating ecosystems that were inherently resistant to warming trends. The first communities to recognize that something fundamental was changing were those living closest to the great ice sheets, where the effects of warming were most dramatic and immediate. These groups, who had survived by adapting to life in the shadow of advancing glaciers, suddenly found themselves dealing with new challenges as their frozen world began to transform. Rivers that had been solid ice for generations began to flow again, creating new waterways and drowning familiar landmarks. Hills and valleys that had been buried under ice for 1,000 years slowly emerged, revealing landscapes that no living human had ever seen. The psychological impact of these changes was complex and often contradictory. Communities that had prayed for generations for relief from the endless cold suddenly found themselves facing uncertainty about whether the warming would continue or whether it might represent a temporary respite before even worse conditions return. The survival strategies that had sustained them through the worst of the Younger Dryas were specifically adapted to stable cold conditions and might prove inadequate for dealing with a rapidly changing environment. The warming process was far from uniform across the globe. While some regions experienced dramatic temperature increases that quickly transformed their landscapes and ecosystems, others remained locked in cold conditions for years or decades after the global trend toward warming had begun. This uneven pattern of change created complex migration pressures as some communities found their territories becoming more habitable, while others faced new challenges as traditional resources became unavailable or unpredictable. The melting of ice that had accumulated over 1,000 years released enormous quantities of fresh water into rivers, lakes, and oceans around the world. This meltwater carried with it sediments, nutrients, and organic materials that had been locked away during the cold period, fundamentally altering aquatic ecosystems and creating new opportunities for both human communities and wildlife populations. Rivers that had been frozen or reduced to trickles became raging torrents that carved new channels and created new lakes and wetlands. The return of flowing water transformed landscapes in ways that went far beyond simple erosion and sedimentation. Plants that had survived the Younger Dryas and isolated refugia suddenly found opportunities to expand their ranges as water became available in regions that had been too dry to support vegetation during the cold period. The re-establishment of hydrological cycles created positive feedback loops that accelerated the warming process as increased vegetation cover reduced the albedo of previously snow-covered surfaces. Animal populations that had been reduced to small isolated groups during the Younger Dryas began to experience population explosions as resources became more abundant and habitats expanded. Species that had been on the verge of extinction suddenly found themselves with opportunities to recolonize territories they had been forced to abandon during the cold period. However, the rapid environmental changes also created new selection pressures that favored individuals and populations that could adapt quickly to changing conditions. The human communities that had survived the Younger Dryas faced the challenge of adapting survival strategies that had been perfected for extreme conditions to a world that was rapidly becoming more hospitable. Skills that had been essential for survival during the cold period, such as extreme resource conservation and emergency shelter construction, remained valuable but needed to be integrated with new approaches appropriate for warmer conditions. The social structures that had evolved to manage scarcity and crisis needed to be modified to take advantage of increasing abundance and opportunity. The transition period created new forms of social stress as communities that had been unified by shared survival challenges began to face choices about whether to maintain their traditional lifestyles or experiment with new approaches made possible by improving conditions. Young people who had grown up during the worst of the cold period often possessed skills and attitudes that were better suited to expansion and experimentation than their elders, who remained focused on conservation and caution based on their longer experience with scarcity. The technological innovations that emerged during the warming period reflected both the accumulated knowledge gained during the survival crisis and the new opportunities presented by improving conditions. Tools and techniques that had been developed for maximum efficiency under extreme constraints were refined and adapted for use in more abundant environments. New technologies emerged that took advantage of resources that had been unavailable or too precious to use during the cold period. The re-establishment of long-distance trade and communication networks was one of the most significant developments of the warming period. Communities that had been isolated by travel dangers and resource scarcity during the Younger Dryas began to re-establish contact with distant groups, exchanging information about survival techniques, territorial conditions, and resource availability. These networks facilitated the rapid spread of innovations and cultural developments across vast geographic areas. The demographic changes that occurred during the warming period were dramatic and far-reaching. Populations that had been reduced to small, scattered groups during the Younger Dryas began to grow rapidly as mortality rates declined and resources became more abundant. This population growth created pressure for territorial expansion and led to increased contact between previously isolated communities, sometimes resulting in conflict as groups competed for the best territories and resources. The development of new settlement patterns reflected both the opportunities created by warming conditions and the lessons learned during the survival crisis. Permanent settlements became more feasible as resources became more predictable and abundant, but the locations chosen for these settlements often reflected knowledge gained during the crisis about defensive positions, resource access, and environmental hazards. The architecture and organization of these settlements incorporated survival features developed during the cold period, even as they adapted to new conditions. The agricultural experiments that began during the warming period built upon plant knowledge that had been accumulated during the crisis when communities were forced to exploit every possible food source. The transition from pure hunting and gathering to managed plant cultivation was facilitated by detailed understanding of plant biology and ecology that had been gained through desperate necessity during the Younger Dryas. The crops that were eventually domesticated were often species that had served as survival foods during the worst periods of scarcity. The spiritual and religious systems that emerged during the warming period reflected both gratitude for improved conditions and anxiety about whether the positive changes would continue. Many of these belief systems incorporated themes of cyclical change and the possibility of future catastrophes, reflecting cultural memories of the dramatic climate reversal that had initiated the Younger Dryas. Rituals and ceremonies developed during the crisis period were often maintained and adapted rather than abandoned, preserving cultural knowledge about survival techniques and crisis management. The artistic traditions that flourished during the warming period show clear influences from the survival culture of the Younger Dryas, while also celebrating the return of abundance and opportunity. Cave paintings and portable art from this period often depict themes of renewal and transformation, while maintaining the symbolic vocabularies that had developed during the crisis. The skills and techniques developed by artists working under extreme constraints during the cold period provided the foundation for more elaborate artistic expressions as resources and leisure time became available. The storytelling traditions that had preserved survival knowledge during the crisis evolved to incorporate narratives about transformation and renewal while maintaining their function as repositories for practical information. Epic stories that had focused on survival and endurance during the cold period expanded to include themes of exploration, innovation, and the establishment of new communities. These narratives served both entertainment and educational functions as communities adapted to their changing world. The end of the Younger Dryas was not marked by a single dramatic event, but rather by the gradual recognition that the world had fundamentally changed and that the strategies that had enabled survival during the crisis were no longer the primary determinants of success. The communities that emerged from this transition period carried with them both the practical knowledge and cultural values that had enabled their ancestors to survive the 1,000 years of cold. But they also possessed the adaptability and innovation skills needed to take advantage of the opportunities presented by their warming world. The pace of warming accelerated dramatically in the final centuries of the Younger Dryas as positive feedback mechanisms reinforced the initial temperature increases. Ice sheets that had been stable for over a millennium began to retreat rapidly, exposing vast areas of land that had been covered by ice for so long that their ecosystems needed to be completely reestablished. The speed of these changes created both opportunities and challenges for human communities that needed to adapt quickly to rapidly shifting conditions. The social and cultural innovations that emerged during the final phases of the Younger Dryas would provide the foundation for the revolutionary developments that would follow in the early Holocene. The communities that had been forged by the crucible of the cold period possessed characteristics of resilience, cooperation, and innovation that would serve them well as they began to experiment with agriculture, permanent settlements, and the complex social organizations that would eventually become the first civilizations. The end of the Younger Dryas marked not just the conclusion of a climatic crisis, but the beginning of a new chapter in human development. The survivors of the 1,000-year winter carried forward both the practical knowledge and cultural wisdom they had gained during their ordeal, but they also possessed the confidence and adaptability that came from having survived the worst that nature could offer. Their descendants would inherit a warming world full of possibilities, but they would also inherit the knowledge that climate could change rapidly and catastrophically, and the survival skills that would enable them to adapt to whatever challenges the future might bring. In the laboratories and research stations scattered across Greenland today, scientists extract cores of ancient ice that contain within their frozen layers the chemical signatures of a climate catastrophe that occurred over 12,000 years ago. Each annual layer of ice tells a story written in isotopes and atmospheric gases, preserving a record of temperatures, precipitation patterns, and atmospheric composition that spans hundreds of thousands of years. But within this vast archive of Earth's climate history, the layers corresponding to the Younger Dryas stand out with stark clarity, marking one of the most dramatic climate transitions ever recorded in the geological record. The ice cores reveal that the transition into the Younger Dryas occurred with shocking rapidity. Temperatures in Greenland dropped by 10 degrees Celsius in less than a decade, transforming the climate system from one state to another almost overnight in geological terms. The speed of this change challenges our most basic assumptions about how climate systems operate and suggests that the seemingly stable conditions we experience today could potentially shift just as rapidly under the right circumstances. Modern climate scientists studying these ancient records are finding uncomfortable parallels between the conditions that preceded the Younger Dryas and the changes occurring in Earth's climate system today. The massive ice sheets that are currently melting in Greenland and Antarctica are releasing enormous quantities of fresh water into the oceans, potentially setting up conditions similar to those that triggered the catastrophic cooling 12,000 years ago. The Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the same ocean current system that shut down during the Younger Dryas, is showing signs of weakening that alarm researchers who understand what such changes could mean for global climate stability. The computer models that climate scientists use to predict future climate changes incorporate lessons learned from studying the Younger Dryas and other abrupt climate transitions in Earth's history. These models suggest that our current climate system exists in a delicate balance that could potentially tip into very different states under sufficient forcing. The greenhouse gases that human activities are adding to the atmosphere are creating conditions that have no precise analog in the recent geological record, making predictions about future climate behavior inherently uncertain. The melting of the Greenland ice sheet, which is currently losing ice at an accelerating rate, represents a potential trigger for abrupt climate change that closely parallels the mechanisms that may have initiated the Younger Dryas. The fresh water being released from this melting is already affecting ocean circulation patterns in the North Atlantic, and some researchers warn that continued ice loss could potentially trigger a partial shutdown of the circulation system that keeps Europe warm and moderates climate conditions across much of the Northern Hemisphere. The lessons of the Younger Dryas extend far beyond simple climate science to fundamental questions about the stability of complex systems and the potential for catastrophic transitions between different states of organization. The Earth's climate system, like many complex systems, appears to have multiple possible stable states, and the transition between these states can occur much more rapidly than the gradual changes that typically characterize long-term climate evolution. Understanding these tipping points and the factors that can trigger rapid transitions has become crucial for predicting how modern climate systems might respond to ongoing human-induced changes. The human communities that survived the Younger Dryas possessed characteristics that modern societies would do well to emulate if we face similar challenges in the future. They were highly adaptable, capable of rapid innovation when circumstances demanded it, and maintained strong social cohesion even under extreme stress. Their survival strategies emphasize resilience over efficiency, redundancy over optimization, and cooperation over competition. These principles, developed under the extreme conditions of Ice Age survival, offer valuable insights for building sustainable societies in an uncertain future. The technological innovations that emerged during the Younger Dryas demonstrate humanity's remarkable capacity for adaptation and problem-solving under extreme constraints. Working with only the materials available in their harsh environment, these ancient communities developed solutions to challenges that would challenge modern engineers. Their achievements in areas like cold weather clothing, efficient shelter construction, and food preservation represent sophisticated applications of physics, chemistry, and biology that were discovered through careful observation and experimentation under life-threatening conditions. The social innovations that characterize Younger Dryas communities are equally impressive and relevant to modern challenges. These societies developed governance systems that could function effectively under extreme stress, resource allocation mechanisms that ensured group survival during periods of scarcity, and conflict resolution processes that maintain social cohesion when disputes could literally mean the difference between life and death for entire communities. The principles they discovered about effective leadership, community organization, and collective decision-making remain relevant for managing complex challenges in the modern world. The psychological resilience that enabled humans to survive the Younger Dryas offers important insights into human nature and our capacity for adaptation under extreme circumstances. The communities that endured this crisis developed mental frameworks and cultural practices that helped them maintain hope and determination through more than 1,000 years of hardship. Their approaches to stress management, community support, and meaning-making provide models for building psychological resilience that could help modern societies cope with the challenges of climate change and other global crises. The environmental lessons of the Younger Dryas are particularly relevant as modern societies grapple with the consequences of human-induced climate change. The rapid ecosystem collapses that characterize the onset of the Younger Dryas demonstrate how quickly complex biological communities can unravel when environmental conditions change faster than evolutionary adaptation can occur. The extinction of megafauna during this period provides a stark warning about the vulnerability of large, specialized species to rapid environmental change. The recovery that followed the end of the Younger Dryas offers both hope and caution for understanding how ecosystems respond to major disturbances. While life proved remarkably resilient and diverse communities eventually re-established themselves across the warming landscape, the recovery process took thousands of years and resulted in biological communities that were fundamentally different from those that had existed before the crisis. Many species that went extinct during the Younger Dryas never recovered, representing permanent losses of biological diversity that affected ecosystem function for millennia. The agricultural revolution that followed the end of the Younger Dryas was made possible by the accumulated knowledge and cultural developments that occurred during the crisis period. The detailed understanding of plant biology, ecology, and manipulation techniques that communities developed while struggling to exploit every possible food source during the cold period provided the foundation for the systematic cultivation and domestication of crops that would transform human civilization. The transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture represents one of the most significant developments in human history, and it emerged directly from the survival strategies developed during humanity's most recent encounter with climate catastrophe. The permanent settlements that became possible as climate conditions stabilized after the Younger Dryas incorporated architectural and organizational principles that had been developed during the crisis period. The emphasis on defensive positions, resource security, and community cooperation that characterize Younger Dryas survival strategies influenced the design and social organization of the first towns and cities. Many of the fundamental principles of urban planning, from defensive considerations to resource management systems, can be traced back to innovations that emerged during the 1,000 years of climate crisis. The religious and spiritual traditions that flourished in the post-Younger Dryas world carried forward both specific practices and general worldviews that had been shaped by the crisis experience. The emphasis on seasonal cycles, the importance of community cooperation, and the recognition of human vulnerability to natural forces that characterize many traditional religious systems reflect cultural memories of the time when these principles were matters of life and death. The rituals and ceremonies that helped communities survive the psychological challenges of the crisis period evolved into elaborate religious traditions that provided frameworks for meaning and social organization in more complex societies. The storytelling traditions that preserved survival knowledge during the Younger Dryas became the foundation for the great mythological and literary traditions that would emerge in subsequent millennia. The narrative structures, thematic content, and symbolic vocabularies that developed during the crisis period influenced the development of epic literature, religious texts, and cultural traditions that continue to shape human civilization today. The universal themes of survival, transformation, and renewal that appear in mythologies around the world may preserve memories of the actual historical experiences that shaped human culture during the Younger Dryas. The trade networks that re-emerged as conditions improved after the Younger Dryas were built upon communication systems and trust relationships that had been maintained during the crisis period. The exchange of survival knowledge, resource information, and technological innovations that had been essential for community survival during the cold period provided the foundation for the commercial networks that would eventually span continents and transform human civilization. The principles of trust, reciprocity, and mutual assistance that governed these early trade relationships reflected hard-learned lessons about the importance of cooperation for long-term survival. The linguistic evolution that occurred during and after the Younger Dryas reflects both the cultural innovations that emerged during the crisis and the population movements and interactions that characterize the recovery period. The specialized vocabularies that developed for describing survival conditions, environmental phenomena, and technical processes during the cold period influenced the development of language families that would eventually spread across vast geographic areas. The communication requirements of survival communities led to innovations in signaling systems, symbolic representation, and information storage that would provide the foundation for later developments in writing and record-keeping. The artistic traditions that flourished after the end of the Younger Dryas built upon both the technical skills and symbolic vocabularies that had been developed during the crisis period. The cave paintings, portable art, and decorative objects that had served both practical and spiritual functions during the survival period evolved into more elaborate artistic traditions that celebrated the return of abundance while preserving cultural memories of the time when survival itself was humanity's greatest achievement. The scientific revolution that would eventually emerge thousands of years later had its roots in the careful observation and experimentation that characterized Younger Dryas survival strategies. The detailed knowledge of natural phenomena, the systematic testing of hypotheses about cause and effect relationships, and the careful preservation and transmission of empirical knowledge that were essential for survival during the crisis period established intellectual traditions that would eventually develop into formal scientific methodologies. The lessons of the Younger Dryas are particularly relevant today as human civilization faces the prospect of climate changes that could potentially be as rapid and dramatic as those that occurred 12,000 years ago. The modern world's dependence on complex technological systems, global supply chains, and specialized knowledge makes us both more capable of responding to challenges and more vulnerable to systemic disruptions than the simple societies that survived the original crisis. The infrastructure that supports modern civilization, from electrical grids to transportation networks to communication systems, has been designed for operation under stable climate conditions and might prove inadequate for dealing with the rapid changes that characterize the Younger Dryas. The agricultural systems that feed billions of people depend on predictable weather patterns and stable environmental conditions that could be disrupted by abrupt climate changes. The urban populations that characterize modern societies would face unprecedented challenges if forced to adapt to rapidly changing environmental conditions. Yet the story of the Younger Dryas also offers reasons for optimism about humanity's ability to adapt to challenging circumstances. The communities that survived that crisis possessed no technology more sophisticated than stone tools and animal skins. Yet they managed to maintain their populations and cultural traditions through more than 1,000 years of extreme conditions. Modern humans possess vastly greater technological capabilities, accumulated scientific knowledge, and organizational capacity that could potentially enable us to adapt to climate challenges more effectively than our ancestors. The key insight from the Younger Dryas experience is that survival in the face of rapid environmental change requires not just technological solutions, but also social innovations that enable communities to maintain cooperation, share resources effectively, and preserve essential knowledge across generations of crisis. The communities that thrived during the Younger Dryas were those that successfully balanced individual needs with collective welfare, maintained flexibility while preserving essential traditions, and developed leadership structures that could function effectively under extreme stress. The modern world's response to climate change will ultimately be judged not just by our technological innovations, but by our ability to maintain social cohesion, international cooperation, and cultural continuity while adapting to rapidly changing conditions. The Younger Dryas offers both a warning about how quickly stable conditions can change and an inspiration about humanity's capacity for adaptation and survival under even the most challenging circumstances. The 1,000 years of the Younger Dryas represent humanity's most recent encounter with truly catastrophic climate change, and the lessons learned during that period remain relevant for understanding how complex societies can respond to rapid environmental transitions. The survivors of that crisis left us not just genetic and cultural legacies, but also a demonstration of human resilience and adaptability that continues to inspire and inform our efforts to build sustainable societies in an uncertain world. As we face the prospect of human-induced climate changes that could potentially be as dramatic as the natural changes that characterize the Younger Dryas, the experiences of our ancestors provide both practical guidance and psychological inspiration for the challenges ahead. They remind us that humans are capable of extraordinary adaptation and innovation when circumstances demand it. But they also warn us that such adaptation comes at enormous cost, and that prevention is preferable to cure when dealing with catastrophic environmental change. The story of the Younger Dryas ultimately demonstrates that climate stability is not a permanent condition, but a temporary gift that enables the development of complex societies and technologies. The communities that best understand this lesson and prepare accordingly will be most likely to thrive regardless of what environmental challenges the future may bring. The 1,000 years of cold taught our ancestors that survival depends not on dominating nature, but on understanding and adapting to its power. And this lesson remains as relevant today as it was 12,000 years